Hi, everyone. My name is Susie Dawson. I'm an activist, a journalist, and the current president of the Internet Party of New Zealand. Welcome to episode 6 of my new series, Opening the Five Eyes, Exposing the Spies. In this series, we look into the methodologies that intelligence agencies use to target citizens around the world. And I have a really special episode lined up tonight. I just need to know that you can all hear me okay and that you can see me. Yeah, people are saying hi, so I'm guessing that you can. Okay, cool. I will forge ahead. Tonight, we're going to talk about some really important documents leaked by Edward Snowden to The Intercept. This was a series of articles written by Glenn Greenwald in The Intercept in 2014. It was also covered by NBC News, CBS, and a few others as well. The series is about what's known as the JTRIG documents. JTRIG is a unit of the GCHQ, which is the UK's version of the NSA. And this JTRIG unit, which stands for Joint Threat Intelligence Group, Joint Threat Research Intelligence Group, are basically cyber stalkers, cyber warriors, as they would think of themselves, who use the online space to target people in war zones, but also around the world, who the deep state or the intelligence agencies have beef with for whatever reason. This has included, and this is verified cases, journalists and activists and dissidents, including in the Five Eyes nations of Australia, New Zealand, Canada, the United States, and the United Kingdom itself. These documents are incredibly significant because they provide a roadmap, an architecture, actually, of oppression being meted out by these agencies. The documents themselves have been written from a psychological perspective. They're littered with psychology terms all the way through it, and they explain and depict precisely, in a series of PowerPoint presentations, precisely how they go about targeting people in online spaces to destroy their reputations. The documents talk about the 5 Ds: deny, distract, degrade, destroy, and deter. And those are the goals of the agencies. They want to distract us. They want to deny us refuge and the ability to communicate. They want to degrade our reputations and our lives. They want to deter us from our activism and from our research. And they use a variety of really insidious, immoral methods to do so. The JTRIG documents are well known to most activists, but what isn't so well known is the real nitty-gritty of how these spies are doing this to us. Now, obviously, my work has been pretty centered over the last few years around my experiences as a targeted activist and journalist, and the types of treatment that I've been dealt out by the intelligence agencies, also other activists I've worked with, and movements that I've been involved in. So I have a lot of practical experience from the perspective of a target to whom these methods have been applied against. What I don't have is the academic experience. What I don't have is the expertise to decipher a lot of the terminology that is employed in the documents. And so I wanted to fill that gap by bringing on a friend of mine to the stream tonight, who is an extremely talented and educated woman. Her name is Lissa K. Johnson. She's a clinical psychologist. She's been looking over these documents with me over the course of the last couple of weeks and discussing them with me. And I wanted to bring her on tonight to give us the theory behind how this program has been put together, and to have her explain to us in layman's terms what some of these words, the language, the linguistics of this architecture of online smearing that have been put together by GCHQ. So I'd like to welcome to the stream now Lissa Johnson. Hi, can you hear me?
I can. Hi, Susie. Thank you for having me on.
Thank you so much for being here tonight. It's really fantastic to have you. So everybody, obviously this stream is in support of my campaign against the Five Eyes, which is the hashtag #1 versus 5i campaign, which you can find more details about at 1versus5i.com. Lissa, do you have any opening remarks about, before we head into the documents themselves, about your recent learnings and your understanding of this program?
Yeah, I do. I mean, first thing to say is I wish I wasn't here having to explain this. I'd rather be here talking to you about something else. And I was vaguely aware of these documents maybe in the last 6 months or so. Somehow I missed them when they were, released and published. And delving into them is quite shocking. It's disturbing as a psychologist to discover that our knowledge is being used and has been being used to deceive people, to discredit people, to destroy their reputations and their lives covertly. Some of the things talked about in the documents, using false flags, using, what do they call them, spoof blog sites, websites, fake victim posts. And they talk about, there's an accompanying 42-page document written by a psychologist with reference materials and explaining the slides. And they talk about forming online aliases to befriend people and deceive them. And what they talk about their goals being is to make something happen in the online world or the real world. So that's all deeply unethical, obviously, just from the point of view of the psychology profession's ethics. I appreciate the opportunity to come on here and talk about it and help people to understand it and avoid being manipulated. It's at least some sort of counterweight to the abusiveness of the tactics. But it's also disturbing because it's, deeply anti-democratic. I mean, it flies directly in the face of Article 19 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is, right to freedom of expression, right to hold opinion without interference, right to communicate ideas and information regardless of medium and across frontiers. And so that's all being utterly violated by getting online, pretending to be someone, befriending someone, manipulating them using all the principles of social influence and social psychology and persuasion and social influence. So, and having said all that, you've been researching this for a long time, Susie, and living in it, and you're probably used to thinking about it. And it's probably, obviously you've gotten used to the fact that this happens, and you've been through it happening, but coming to it afresh, it's quite shocking and, sort of unbelievable as well. And, I found myself thinking, really? Against activists, against people with absolutely no charge against them, no criminal record, nothing to do with terrorism or national security. And as you say, the supporting documentation and reports in The Intercept and so on go into how, known targets have been just activists and people targeted on the basis of their political views. And in the documents, they talk about targeting people for, it's known that GCHQ targets people on the basis of being politically radical. And, that's a very subjective term, isn't it? A Republican's radical is quite different from a Sanders supporter's radical, quite different to a radical if you don't vote for a major party. So, and historically, since 9/11, the term domestic terrorist has been applied to, pro-environmental organisations, like grassroots activists. Most recently, the term black identity extremist has been coined by the FBI to go after grassroots activists in the US. So it's being increasingly broadened, that sort of national security terrorism umbrella. So, people who are new to this might be thinking, no, but surely this is for terrorists or pedophile rings. But when you look at what national security and terrorism has come to mean, it essentially means political opposition when it's being used to go after non-violent groups. And Occupy Wall Street, as you know, that happened to you. You lived through that. And apparently, so anyway, long-winded way of saying you know, what you're talking about, you're not speculating that this happens, and it's not just your word for it that it's happened to you. It's documented and it's known that these are among the targets, along with people who are suspected of crime, along with actual terrorists, suspected terrorists, along with actual, you know, people doing harm. It's also being used against non-violent activists. But also I'd encourage people, as we're talking through the slides, not to be freaked out if you are an activist, because it's easy to be, and not to respond by becoming suspicious of everybody, because, you know, the tactics here are about pretending to be a real person, using psychological tactics to befriend you and trick you. So once you know that, because they're mimicking real interactions and people coming from a genuine place, it's very easy to then become mistrustful and see manipulation everywhere. So rather than that, as we're talking through, I'd encourage people to think about more about A, awareness of these tactics, but B, kind of self-awareness, you know, because they talk about exploiting people's personalities, which we'll get into, which, you know, it's quite sophisticated techniques now for personality profiling based on digital footprints. So just be aware of your psychological sort of strengths and weaknesses that can be tugged on. So you're somebody under fear who tends, when you feel stressed, do you tend to become a bit bossy and dominant, or do you tend to become a bit submissive? Are you somebody who likes to rescue people? If someone asks you for help, you find it hard to say no. Somebody who's easily flattered or easily put down. Maybe think in terms of that, just being self-aware as you navigate the online world.
So while the targets are often dissidents or activists or journalists, this really is affecting everybody, because first of all, we know that if there is a target, that everybody around that target is also targeted, and everybody around them, two concentric circles. It's known as the two hops principle of the NSA and of the Five Eyes. And William Binney, the ex-NSA technical director, has explained this at length, and also even James Clapper in testimony also talked about how the NSA uses two hops. So for every one person that's targeted, hundreds of people get drawn into that net just by association. And you're absolutely correct that terrorist is an ever-expanding definition. We talked in the last episode of the show last week about the new terrorism suppression bill, so-called Terrorism Suppression Control Orders Bill, which has been introduced in New Zealand. And in that bill, it says that a terrorist doesn't have to be a terrorist. A terrorist can be someone who supports or comforts a terrorist group or organization, and that person doesn't have to know that they have given comfort or aid to a terrorist group or organization, and the terrorist group or organization that they don't know that they've given aid or comfort to doesn't have to have actually committed a terrorist act or have actually done anything at all. In fact, so here we go, that it's now not just terrorists that are being targeted, it's anybody vaguely associated with anything that the government doesn't like or wants to brand as terrorism, regardless of whether any actual terrorism has taken place. And the legislation specifically states that no terrorist act needs to have been committed, and that the people who are being targeted don't need to be aware that they are somehow associated with this. We're seeing the secret courts, the secret legislation, the prosecution-only trials, the whole thing is just insane. And as far as I'm concerned, what's driving that is the privatization of spying. It's that they've introduced a profit model, which means you have now all of these subcontractors and contractors. It's not even the intelligence agencies themselves as much as it is who they contract the work out to, and then who they contract the work out to. And when you expand the so-called intelligence community to encompass this behemoth structure of all of these private companies, well, what do you need to make more profit? You need growth. And what does growth mean in the surveillance industry? It means more targets. And if you need more and more targets, then what do you have to do to get more targets? You have to expand the definitions of who you can target. And that actually leads me straight to the very first slide of the JTRIG files, because I noticed that there, and I'll just screen share and just bear with me a second. Here we go. And I'm just going to full screen that for you. This is the very first slide. It's a title slide, and it says JTRIG, and it has their evil little logo, and it says online human intelligence. And what that tells me is that human intelligence, which has traditionally been the practices of espionage between nations, it's been state versus state, it's been spying on diplomats, spying on diplomatic negotiations, etc., etc. That practice of human intelligence, of actually dispatching teams of spies out to target political leaders and whatever, that's been going on for, probably many hundreds of years, but certainly throughout the 20th century and beyond. They have taken that discipline and they've decided, you know what, we don't actually have to dispatch spies to other countries around the world. We don't, to achieve our aims of targeting people. What we can do is take that into the online environment, and we can create these teams of digital human intelligence. And this ties into what, I'll just take it off screen share for a sec. This ties into what we know colloquially, what's talked about in the media as trolls. And I don't think it's accurate to call them trolls, because trolls makes it sound like it's some kid in his basement saying some smart aleck thing on the internet to get attention or whatever. That's not what these trolls are and these troll farms are. What they are is politically motivated, politically funded teams of operatives. And those operatives are trained, they receive professional training, and they work according to these manuals. And this JTRIG manual that we're about to work our way through is a classic example of one of those training manuals for these teams of operatives. And so what we see is that trolls are actually a professional discipline. They are not some ad hoc thing that comes together spontaneously. They are trained and they are funded, and they lead straight back to the government and to the security agencies ultimately. So I just wanted to make that point. I'd also just like to make a point briefly too about this material that we're about to go through in the context of Edward Snowden. So you see a lot of criticism about Snowden. There's a lot of conspiracy theorizing about him. I quite often hear, oh, well, he's a CIA plant. He's meant to discredit the NSA. It's some internecine warfare between the intelligence agencies. We can't take him seriously, blah, blah, blah. Even without Snowden's revelations of mass surveillance, even without Snowden's revelations about the drone war and extrajudicial killings and the NSA drone list, as was being worked on by Jake Applebaum and Laura Poitras directly from the Snowden files, even without the hundreds of other revelations from the Snowden files, including many revelations about the CIA. If you go to edwardsnowden.com and click on document search and type CIA and press enter, he actually leaked a mountain of info about the CIA and how they operate, not just about NSA. Even if none of that had come to public awareness, just this JTRIG manual alone that we're about to study, just the contents of these documents are such a significant contribution to the historical record and such an incredible empowerment of targets of intelligence agencies, of activists and journalists and dissidents, that alone, these documents alone that we're about to show you, prove his veracity without any shadow of a doubt. And as usual, if you set aside the narratives about the person and you look at the content of the disclosures, it tells the true story. It tells the truth about Edward Snowden in these files right here. So from my perspective, these coming from having been subjected to techniques like this and then seeing them all neatly laid out in these training manuals and seeing the methodologies in black and white, this is the greatest gift that could ever have been given to me as an activist. And it's our obligation to take the knowledge that we have from our practical experience, from our academic experience like Liz Johnson's, and from within these documents themselves, and spread it to as wide an audience as possible, because the only way that we can hope to defend ourselves against multi-billion-dollar industry of interfering in our lives and manipulating us is to educate ourselves and to make others aware about this. So without any further ado, we'll move back now to the files. Right. So they say online human intelligence. So, as I've just said, this is moving what used to be teams of spies on the ground into the online space. They are hoping to achieve strategic influence. Now, that tells me two things. And Lissa, I would like you to jump in at any point if you have a different interpretation than what I'm offering.
I will.
To me, the fact that it's strategic, this is a long-term view, a long-term undertaking. I know from studying the other NSA files that these guys do like 20-year planning documents. Like they're literally thinking about what's the world going to be like in 20 years' time? What infrastructure do we want to have in place for 20 years' time? So strategic, I see, as them having a long-term view of wanting to manipulate outcomes in the long term. The word influence is very telling to me because they aren't just trying to influence targets. They're trying to influence populations. They're trying to influence nations. And that takes it back to, yet again, it not just being about the individual targets of activists, dissidents, or journalists. It's actually the entire of society that they're trying to influence. Here we see disruption in CNA, and this to me is the method. So online human intelligence is who, and strategic influence is what, and disruption in CNA is how. Now, CNA is a computer network attack. So this is about the technical intrusion of devices where they're actually compromising hardware and manipulating your ability to communicate and violating your privacy. Disruption is, this tells me, disruption is what they're wanting to do to groups or disrupting activities that they don't like. And CNA is a primary method as to how they're going to achieve that. Do you have anything to add to this, Lisa?
Yeah, I mean, the way I read those is similar to you because that kind of maps onto some of the slides later. And the online human intelligence they have on the left, they have 3 columns later on, and I sort of read that as essentially kind of assessment and information gathering, kind of monitoring, etc. And then the strategic influence, I think they call it information operations as well when they put it into 3 columns. And information operations is, essentially it's the, like you say, it's the what, it's the psychological operations, the propaganda, the manipulation, the deception, which is, so the first 2 are probably the ones that you and I are talking about most today because that's where all the psychological stuff is. And then the disruption in CNA is more, as you say, the technical, how to practically and electronically do it, I think.
Okay, so we'll move on to the next one. So this is the academic disciplines and the principles that they're bringing together in order to execute their strategy. So we have anthropology, psychology, economics, biology, which is just horrifying, political science, history, and sociology. Lisa, do you want to delve into what those are? And I'm going to disappear for a second, but I'm right here.
Sure. Well, I mean, psychology obviously is the part that I know about. And political science, I mean, psychology is related to some of those. Political science and psychology often overlap when, political science is about the study of how people interact with the political world and individual interaction with more collective sort of political processes. And anthropology, sociology. I mean, sociology and psychology. Sociology is more examining human behaviour at the level of whole societies as opposed to the individual level. Economics, most people don't know, is actually a behavioural science. It's treating the world and economies as kind of a giant human experiment because economic theories are always theories based on predictions about human behaviour. So, they all link together in various ways. I'm not sure where biology comes into it. I don't know what they're planning to do with our biology or how they're planning to leverage and exploit that. But, I mean, obviously the part that I know about is the psychological part. And it's
okay, so what I see on the screen, I see a couple of ways of looking at this. One is that these are the disciplines that they're bringing to bear against targets. Anthropology would be the study of groups of humans, so that would be the group dynamics of activist groups or movements, social movements, et cetera, and the manipulation thereof. psychology is obviously the profiling, the psychological profiling of the individuals involved. Economics, they absolutely go after the financial resources and seek to control the access to resources of targets, also the economics of groups of targets, of organizations. They use economics to influence, they use economics to undermine, they use economics to create or suppress competition. They seek to control the flow of money to and from individuals and organizations, and to study that. Biology, to me, says biometrics, because we know that they collect biometrics on targets, and increasingly they're finding ways to collect biometrics on entire populations, not just on targets. Political science is a bit outside of my field, though I would imagine that it would be both the study of the political dynamics of groups, the political beliefs of individuals, and possibly the subversion thereof. History is a really interesting one, because I know that one of the first things that they do when they have a target is they go back as far as they possibly can into the history of that person's life, of their socialization, of the people around them, of their environmental conditions and their geographical conditions, their demographics, etc., etc., etc. And they attempt to build this historical profile of an individual, which is a lot of what Snowden is warning people about, in particular at the moment with permanent record, is that by creating a permanent record of someone's life practically from birth, that's what they're ultimately seeking to do, is to know and control, to know the history and control the present and future of any individual on Earth. And sociology is probably closer to your field of expertise as well, certainly than mine, Lissa. But I would imagine that that is about the relationships and the interrelationships between individuals and the communications. Would that be fair?
Yeah, that sounds... yeah, I mean, sociology is kind of study of social movements and societies as a whole. So, and there are things on the slides about sort of being aware of cultural differences and, you know, how that interacts with individual psychology. So that could be partly what they're talking about there too.
So where the slide is a lead-in by them to what's in the rest of the training manual in terms of empowering their agents to target people online, this slide actually says something else to me, which is very interesting. This slide is also, without meaning to be, I think, when the authors put it together, it's also a really good depiction of the priorities for information gathering of the intelligence agencies as a whole. Because we saw in the Snowden documents, NSA, like biology, for example, NSA was they have what they call selectors, which are the specific items of information that they look through their eye of Sauron to gather information on. And a selector could be an email address of an individual, or it could just be a keyword of any topic. And in there, they had listed certain strands of DNA as selectors to be spied on. So they would put in the strand of DNA and it would search every email of every scientist on the planet about their findings or their research, you know, educational facilities, et cetera, R&D, the whole 9 yards. And so they could actually, they were looking for information on by things that related to biological findings. They have what they call the Global Economic Security Day, where they're going after, it's all once again about economic control. They have, you know, to me, each of these terms relate to priority areas of the intelligence agencies in which to have influence or control, even though in this document they're in the context of employing them against a target or using them to better target individuals. Okay, so moving down, it looks like here they've actually given us a helpful breakdown of their methods as they apply to each of those areas. Do you want to talk through this screen, Lissa?
Oh, yeah. I mean, well, obviously the areas that I know about are psychology, a little bit political science and sociology. To be honest, some of the stuff they've got over near sociology belongs over in psychology, really. So there are a few of these slides I think, I wonder if whoever put this slide together really knows their stuff as much as they would like their audience to think they do. There's a very detailed 42-page document written by a psychologist that underpins the psychological aspects of this. But it's sort of the words around the psychology part of that slide are an introduction to some of the main areas of knowledge and research in psychology that the slides draw on in order to deceive and influence people online. So we're talking about magic and deception there, and I think overall what these strategies are doing, or the way they've kind of presented them in these slides, is to take literatures on magic and perceptual illusions on one side, on the psychology of that, which is all about mostly visually tricking people, and literatures on scams as well, scamming people. So that literature is about deceiving people, for instance, to see something that's not there or not see something that's right in front of your eyes, to create perceptual illusions. So some of these slides are talking about that and the psychology of that. How do you do that? How do you get people to not see what they're looking at, or see something that's not there? With more complex literature around social psychology, social influence, persuasion, relationships, groups, that kind of thing, group dynamics. So that, influence, trust, obedience, compliance, that's what those things relate to, that more social psychological literature, and they're kind of bringing them together. The social psychology literature, of course, isn't intended to be used for deception, and some of the authors they mentioned by name have written whole chapters about, these tactics should not be used to exploit people by deceiving them, which is exactly how they're being used here. But they're taking those two frameworks, the magic, perceptual illusion, deception, and the social influence, and putting those kind of within that to sort of perform, rather than just visual deception, social, personal, cognitive deception about how you're viewing the world, how you're behaving, what you believe, etc. So trust is important to that. And the personality part there is about tailoring that to individuals. So they talk in the slides about assessing people's personalities based on their digital footprint. And I think since 2011, that field has progressed enormously. That's a very sophisticated, branch of intelligence and artificial intelligence now. I think Cambridge Analytica, they have 5,000 data points on 240 million Americans. So, and based on research that was done by psychologists in Cambridge, very accurate personality profiles can be compiled just by things like Facebook likes and what you click on online. It's essentially the same as filling out a personality questionnaire. And we're in a strange situation now where the private intelligence companies, like you're saying, Susie, for instance, SCL, Cambridge Analytica's parent company, looks to have a much larger database and knowledge base on psychology and the relationship, personality and the relationship between personality and behaviour, and how to target people for influence based on their personality. There's a weird situation where private intelligence firms have collected and conducted mass experiments on the US population without their knowledge, e.g. via Cambridge Analytica, etc. So they have this huge knowledge base. So that's what the personality part about that is tailoring, helping to tailor their approach to you and how they seek to befriend you and how they seek to influence you, tailoring that to your individual personality. Again, to encourage people not to be freaked out by that, but just to be self-aware and, as we talk it through, try and think about the ways in which your particular personality could be tagged upon to be influenced.
Can you speak to elicitation?
That's not really, that's not really a term that's used in psychology, but what they're talking about doing here is, they say that their goal is to make something happen, either in the online world or in real life. So I assume they're talking about eliciting behaviour. So the whole point of all this isn't just to change your opinions and change your mind, it's to get you to do something, whether that's, attack somebody's character or fire them or smear them or, join a movement or leave a movement. So I assume that's what they're talking about there. I could be wrong.
Absolutely.
It's always hard with these slides. If you don't have somebody, if you don't have the person who put the slides together, and some of these slides are very busy, sometimes it's, it's a bit of guesswork as to what they're talking about. But that would be my guess as to what they're talking about there. And below that, belief and religion. I mean, belief, that's a very broad term. It's like saying vehicle. But, they're talking about exploiting people's prior beliefs and, altering their beliefs in the subsequent slides. And the religion, I mean, I guess that would be part of tailoring the approach to the person, but also some of the terms they talk about are about what drives religious beliefs. There's sort of psychological explanations that are put forward for religious beliefs. And of course, people who have religious beliefs would probably disagree. And the person who put that literature together was religious, and then he renounced his religion and then did some studies about what causes people to believe in an unseen force and that kind of thing. So in the slides, they talk about using those processes to make people believe in something that's not real. So I think that's partly what they're talking about there. No, I'm not saying that religion is not real, but that's what that research draws on.
So very interestingly, here under biology, they've got neuroscience. And that is a humongous topic in and of itself. And I know it'll be very much of interest to many targets of the intelligence agencies, because we know there has been a humongous amount of work and also funding poured into the exploitation of neuroscience against targets as well. I would go so far as to say the intelligence agencies have displayed an obsession with how the brain works, how the brain functions, how we think from at that biological level, and how that can be manipulated as well. Evolutionary biology, do you have any take on that?
Evolutionary biology. I mean, evolutionary psychology, I'd probably have more of a thought about. I'm not biology. I'm not 100% sure what they're talking about there. Evolutionary psychology is about explaining human tendencies in terms of the human need for survival. They talk about group-based processes later. That's often talked about in those terms, that we're a tribal animal and we're really wired, which is just very true, really wired to sort of hunker down into smallish groups and go to war with other groups. So especially under conditions of threat or insecurity. So I'm not sure if that's what they're talking about there, but they certainly talk about exploiting that later on. And with the neuroscience, one of the things that they talk about, there's a fair bit of neuroscientific research into magic tricks, which they are obviously drawing on here. And a lot of what that says is that attention is absolutely everything. If you can get someone to think about attend to something else, they'll track people's eye movements so they can see exactly where people are looking, and they manipulate their attention. And people, because attention is like a spotlight and your brain only physically registers what you're attending to. You can be looking straight at something, but if your attention is elsewhere, you literally won't see what's right in front of your eyes. Which is a bit of they use that as a metaphor for what they're trying to achieve, and they talk a lot about attention and manipulating attention. So that might be partly what they're talking about there. I think it makes me think of Russiagate. I think Russiagate is one giant exercise in that. Everyone's looking over here.
Mass distraction.
Russiagate, and there's all sorts of sleights of hand, pocketing the last vestiges of democratic freedoms over here while you're looking over here at Russiagate.
I would argue that the entire political electoral cycle is also about mass distraction. For an 18-month period, there is nothing else to be discussed except this election, and we're all focused on our one vote every 4 years and missing the fact that we can vote on an American Idol once a week, but we have no political say-so outside of this all-consuming once every 4 years giant spectacle of the elections, which don't ever seem to, no matter who gets into power, manifestly change or alter the true power structure.
That's right, yeah, and that tugs really hard on those group processes, that evolutionary psychology, so that people, and that's one of the most easily inflamed psychological sort of vulnerabilities that human beings have. So that's whipped up, from years on end.
Plays on the tribalism.
Exactly, yeah. And that tugs on people so strongly that they're motivated, so strongly motivated to invest in that it's a extremely powerful distraction and diversion.
So over here in sociology, we've got compliance and obedience, which seems to be goals of the intelligence agencies to provoke compliance or obedience. But I would also imagine that it's probably the study of the preconditions, the social preconditions, which create compliance and obedience, such as social pressure amongst peer groups.
Yeah, well, I'm assuming we'll talk in more detail about each of these things when we get to slide 10, the relativity side. Yeah, there's a big psychological literature on both of those things, compliance and obedience. So, I mean, to my mind, that's what they're referencing. They're referencing the literature on what drives people to comply. So compliance is going along essentially with, with your peers, with the people around you. It's a form of conformity, whereas obedience is basically doing what authorities tell you to do. So following the instructions of somebody in a position of authority. And they talk about exploiting both of those things. And there's literatures on how to do that, which I guess we'll talk about more when we get into the nitty-gritty.
Sure. And
unless you want me to talk about them here, I can. But
no, it's fine. Let's follow through with the slides. And obviously the study of social networks and human interaction. And then under political science, they've got key leader engagement. This is another obsession of the intelligence agencies, is identifying leadership, identifying who displays leadership characteristics, who performs leadership roles. This is one of the reasons that the Occupy movement confounded them greatly. Occupy didn't have a leadership structure, so they just went after those of us who were the most visibly effective and treated us as if we were a leadership structure, and mercilessly targeted us as a result. And they've also got their global trends under political science. So I would suggest that they are probably also analysing, particularly I would think in terms of social movements, they'd be looking at those big picture trends, social trends.
Makes sense.
Okay, so moving on to the next slide. S4, the 4 S's: science, SIGINT, skills, and systems. So the science is a lot of, I think, what we just discussed, and also all of the things that are involved in this document. The SIGINT is the electronic spying. So this is the actual invasions of our privacy that they perpetrate in order to gather the intelligence about us, in order to fill out that psychological profile of us and that social profile of us. Skills is the methods by which they exploit us at a human intelligence level. So the skills I take to, though arguably it would also speak to technical skills in performing the online human intelligence. They have to have some kind of technical capability. And systems will be their information systems within the intelligence agencies. So that would be the systems by which they gather the information, the systems by which they analyze the information, the systems by which they report on the information. Anything to add there?
No, that sounds right to me.
There you go. We want to build cyber magicians.
You know what I mean? When I looked at that, when I was looking through all this, I thought, they're using their own tactics against the trainees. So what they're doing there is flattering their trainees, wanting them to feel like they're turning them into cyber magicians. The reality is that the more boring, complex social influence, perception, persuasion literature and so on has a lot more to offer than the literature on magic tricks, but I read it as this is their way of packaging it and, making it sort of sexy and attractive for their trainees. So.
You know, just since you've brought up that point, I'm actually just going to swap to a different slide for a sec that I was planning to show in this as well. In, I think, our second episode in this series, we talked about IC Watch, the intelligence community watch database that WikiLeaks published, which is a humongous compilation of open source information about intelligence operatives that they had published in their own curriculum vitae on the website LinkedIn. And a very savvy then teenage developer was able to download all of their CVs from LinkedIn, and so that researchers could study those CVs, because in the CVs, the operatives brag about who they worked for, what they did, what missions they were on, what operations they were involved in, who they were targeting. There are many references in the CVs to, I targeted Occupy Wall Street, I targeted the Anonymous Movement, I targeted blah, 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 and this is how I did it, and this is who I did it for, and this was my job title, and this is when I did it, etc., etc. And there was one that I was sent tonight by Elizabeth Mueller, who's the researcher and activist, also a target, who appeared with me in episode 2. And the reason this is relevant to what you were just talking about, I'll just screen share this, and I may have to zoom in to make it actually readable for you. The reason this is particularly interesting is because this slide from the CV of an intelligence analyst, she conducted honeypots, according to her, she conducted honeypots and elicitation. And where are we here? Here we go. She was an interrogator and used social networking sites operating in both urban and rural environments. She staged questions in a manner that would lead students. So staged questions in a manner that would lead students to give up information by the use of elicitation, sleep deprivation, deception, friendship, or unconventional methods.
Maybe elicitation means interrogation. Anyway, but yeah, that's shocking, isn't it? I mean, wow, it's quite amazing that it's so openly talked about and admitted.
I absolutely think that elicitation is them attempting to bait somebody by whatever method into taking an action that they otherwise would not have taken. That's absolutely my read. That's absolutely my read of elicitation. But I just wanted to quickly show that. I just wanted to quickly show that slide to bring home for people that this isn't just theory in a PowerPoint presentation. There are people who make a career out of doing this. There are people who wake up every single day and go to work and destroy people's lives and collect a paycheck and go home and then wake up and do it all over again. It's something that just floors me because I can't imagine ever doing that. But
it's very difficult to believe.
Thousands. They're there by the thousands. Okay,
I mean, on that point, just on that point, back to the sort of the broader context in which this is happening. We're talking about GCHQ here, and apparently, I don't think it's launched yet, but it's close. There's a new merger of GCHQ and the Ministry of Defence, whose purpose is to quadruple staff dedicated to offensive as opposed to defensive online covert actions such as this, and they're seeking psychologists, and they've called it an online SAS. That's a new thing coming out. So we can, it sounds like...
And see, that the reason they can call it an online SAS, well, there's a couple of points there. One is because it's literally cyber warfare. They call it cyber warfare, and it's the cyber warfare doctrine. And the second point there is that this information, and this is a point I keep struggling to get people to understand, they are not spying and information gathering as a passive exercise. They're not doing it just so that they know. They act on the information that they gain through the spying. It is an active enterprise, not a passive enterprise. And in terms of the war zones, they openly talk in the NSA documents about, we're working in support of capture and kill missions. Someone is going to die, or someone is going to be detained at some CIA black site, or someone is going to have whatever other unpleasant run-in with law enforcement of some variety as a result of the spying that we're undertaking and the targeting that we're undertaking. And unfortunately, when you look at the outcomes, the real-world outcomes for targeted journalists and dissidents, I mean, Jamal Khashoggi was a targeted journalist. He was targeted using private sector NSO group spyware and targeted through someone that he knew as well. So yet again, they came at him through a social connection. He was targeted and it cost him his life. He wasn't in a war zone. He wasn't a terrorist and he wasn't an enemy combatant. He was just somebody who was politically opposed to a regime which had sufficient money and resources to be able to hire mercenary hacking companies to provide them with software to be able to target him in such a way. So this capture and kill operation premise from the war zone and NSA providing technical support to those operations does expand out to the targeting of people outside of war zones who are not terrorists, but who can still end up in jail or dead or having their lives destroyed by some means or another. And we're going to now go through the rest of those slides and learn a bit more about exactly what they are doing and how they're doing it.
And maybe before we do that, in the spirit of not freaking people out who are, everyday activists or, say WikiLeaks supporters, anybody who's frightened they might be targeted. I mean, I don't think most people have to worry about being captured and killed. Of course, it happens to people who are high profile, but I think I encourage people not to give up on, their political activism or their political activities or their online political discourse for fear of that happening. What are your thoughts about that, Susie? Because
I have a couple of thoughts about that. First of all, fear is a tactic that they use to induce action from people. They want you to be scared. They want you to fear. And personally, I think the unknown is a lot more scarier than the known. And I think that the more, I can certainly say as a target, when I didn't understand what the hell was happening to me or why it was happening to me, that was far scarier. In fact, I was terrified in those days. And I find that the more that I understand, oh, this is what they do and this is who's doing it and this is how they're doing it and this is why and when and where, the more that I gain that information, all the pieces start to make sense to me. And I don't have that cognitive dissonance of this is what I'm seeing, but I have no knowledge to place this in context. So I would think that learning information like this would empower people to not be scared, because I think it's what we're doing here. Using the magic analogy, right? What we're doing here is we're showing people, oh, that's how the magician levitated.
Exactly.
Oh, yes. That's how he cut his assistant in half, and but then put her back together, and she's still alive. We're lifting that veil, right, on the Wizard of Oz, and at the end of the day, it really is just a bunch of dodgy old guys and whoever they can hire for whatever money to get to do this. These people who are doing it are cogs in a wheel that themselves they are intimidated by, and that's why they comply with it. It's them who are obedient and being coerced to comply within a moral and arguably illegal system.
So, no, you read my mind. I think that's a useful way to think about it, rather than seeing people as powerful, evil, manipulators who can, work you like a puppet. Just they're people who are subject to the very same influences that we'll talk about here of compliance and obedience and conformity and, manipulation.
And can you imagine how trapped they feel? These operatives, these agents, they know full well what will happen to them if they don't toe the line. The whole process of vetting them for employment, they're being spied on. Their entire history is being gathered and analyzed. They have to go and do, they get probed by psychologists. They have to do psychological assessments. They have to sit in a chair and do a polygraph. They have to talk about their sex lives and their parents and their God knows who else. They are exposed in the same way targets are, but they're institutionally exposed. And even though it's supposedly on a voluntary basis, and even though that there's an accompanying belief system that they're conditioned into in order to be able to justify it to themselves, they know deep down, they understand full well that they could themselves become the target. And that is living in a state of fear. When you, whether it's subconsciously or just deep down, understand that you're participating in, and I keep saying architectural repression because that's the best words I can come up with. When you understand that you're inside that and you're a part of it and you're compliant with it and that ultimately you're culpable for it, I mean, there's got to be all kinds of like self-loathing issues going on there and God knows what else. But more so, just feeling trapped because, I mean, look at Snowden. Snowden had to run basically to Hong Kong, had to get outside of his country to even have a hope of talking about this stuff. It as easily could have cost him his life. It is easy. I mean, I often go back to trying to remind people what it was really like in June 2013, because people say, oh, well, Snowden's big and famous and everything's easy for him and great for him, not like Julian. Okay, in June 2013, we were all expecting every single morning to wake up to the headline, Snowden captured or Snowden killed. And the next day we're expecting it, and the next day we're expecting it, and the next day we're expecting it. It was by a hair's breadth that he got out. It was by a hair's breadth that he got asylum. It was by a hair's breadth that he is not in jail and that he was not killed. And just stop and think about the impacts of that on a human being. And I can tell you right now, it's not all roses. And those who think that being in exile for 5 years or 6 years, as he has been now in Russia, is all roses, are naive at best. But I digress. Back to
well, sort of on that point.
Yes. I did. Sorry, there was a second thing other than why we should empower ourselves with education and knowledge so that we aren't subjected to the fear and the fear of the unknown. I would say one other point on the don't feel like you're a target. You are a target. Every single person is a target because that's what mass surveillance is. Mass surveillance is wholesale targeting of a population. The question is to what extent you are individually or personally targeted. Because the whole population is targeted by mass surveillance, but individual targeted surveillance is a different kettle of fish. That's where you go through the types of things that I went through in New Zealand and that many other people have also gone through. Every person... Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, you had a lot of grounds on which to be heavily targeted. You were part of Occupy Wall Street, and we know that was surveilled and targeted, and in collaboration with banks before anybody even camped into Cody Park, and it was violently broken up. And so, you were part of that. You were against the TPP. I mean, former, people who used to work in terrorism task forces and so on in the US say that where there's a corporate lobby group to lobby Congress, those are the groups that get targeted. So,
Yeah, and that's what happened with the Kim.com raid and the FBI incursion into New Zealand, which is the other mitigating factor or the other aggravating factor that occurred at the same time. They raided Kim, the FBI came to New Zealand and raided Kim.com's mansion 3 days before they came and raided the Occupy Auckland site.
So you've had connections to very high profile people, and you're a great organizer, you get big things happening, so that thing of going after leaders. I mean, I can see why there are a lot of reasons why you would have been heavily targeted to the extent that you were driven out of the
Look,
country.
the fundamental reason I've learned this from their own documentation as well, is that they deem me to be a radical. And what they do is they classify, when they first look at people, they classify them into 4 different categories. And the first category is they decide you're an opportunist, which means they can give you some leg up in society, some career opportunity, some money, financial opportunity, and lead you away from activism by those means. That you are an idealist, which means you're just in it because you're like utopian, you want a utopian world, and that therefore you can be disillusioned, and so they go after your ideology and they disillusion you and push you out of activism that way, tell you, it's no good, this isn't achieving anything, nothing will ever come of this, and therefore dissuade you on that basis. That you're a realist, in which case they can use pessimism and deter you by those means, or that you are a radical, and the radicals are those who they determine will not stop by being offered, they won't sell out, they're incorruptible. They're people like Julian. Julian could have been a multimillionaire many times over in the tech industry if he'd just done nothing other than employ his development skills. Snowden could be a multimillionaire many times over just on the basis of his tech skills in the industry. I was working in the software industry and earning big money, and I walked away from it to earn basically nothing as a journalist, because I knew that me building print portals for universities for the rest of my life was no contribution to society, even if it came with a big paycheck. But my journalism, my activism was something that could make a difference, and that therefore I owe it to this planet and to
I guess what I'm saying is that,
so the radicals are a minority, but at the same time, what we need is to be a bit more radical as societies, and to not have individuals that are martyred and hung out to dry. The change has to be societal change. We can't just rely on random mavericks, on the Julian Assanges of this world. We have to take some responsibility en masse.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's interesting about the different sort of. That's part of the individual profiling, I guess, what you're talking about with the idealist versus the opportunist and so on. And I'm concerned that people watching will think, "Oh my God, I'm not going to be an activist. I'm not going to be radical. I'm not going because I might be driven to Russia." And I suppose what I'm saying, you're very modest, but I'm saying you were very powerful radical, and that's why able to do big things and organise a lot, which is why. It might have been more extreme for you than it might be for somebody else. And encouraging people.
Well, look, we can be savvy about it. Like, something I say to people quite often is, you don't have to do everything. Just do something. Do one thing, and then go back to normal life for 6 months. Just do something. Yeah,
and don't let this scare you off. And most of it's about trying to befriend people and get them to smear other people, or get involved in something that will disrupt the movement, that will fracture it, that will undermine it, rather than the sort of capture and kill kind of targeting. I guess I'm saying there's a spectrum of targeting. So most of it's to try and disrupt movements and weaken movements. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. Well, these influence operations are being applied to millions of people, so it's not about capture and kill at all. It's just simply about change your opinion about something.
Because we were talking before about domestic terrorism. The definition since 9/11 of a domestic terrorist in the US is somebody who seeks to alter or influence government policy. So it's anybody.
And there's currently a new anti-terrorism bill tabled in the US as well, which does exactly that as well, which codifies it.
Yeah, at the moment it only justifies surveillance and covert searches and that kind of thing. But if this bill passes, it criminalises it. So then it could be not just the term terrorist, but the term criminal could encompass activism. So it's equally as frightening as that New Zealand bill we were talking about. But one more hopeful thing I wanted to say before, when we were talking about the influence agents and their own processes of conformity and influence and intimidation and fear. one heartening thing, there's a 42-page document that accompanies these slides written by a psychologist providing advice, and she's talking about some of the feedback they were getting from their agents and their operatives. And I noted that a lot were expressing concern about the ethics of doing this and moral qualms about deceiving people. So that was heartening to read. People aren't just obeying without any qualms. I mean, obviously, they're convinced to do it anyway, but it's a little bit of a window onto the humanity that's there.
Well, you talk about social pressure, creating compliance. Well, I think there's a large portion of the workforce of these intelligence agencies that are in a social pressure cooker where they have to say, oh, yes, we're doing the right thing. Oh, yes, we're fighting terrorism. Oh, yes, blah, 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 blah. I think they know full well underneath that. Even if they can't admit it because of their peer groups, even if they know that they will make a target of themselves by speaking out about it, I think they under everything, they actually know. They know that what they're doing is wrong. They know that they're not targeting terrorists. It's mind-boggling to me, and has been all along, that I'm a non-violent person, no criminal record, no history of any violence whatsoever, no intention of violence, no associations with violent people, single mother from the suburbs, and to have military, that's literally what it is, military agencies and military resources used to target me, is just the most egregious abuse of the public contract. And we're seeing that on a wide scale here, because ultimately this is military grade targeting, whether it's farmed out to contractors or whatnot, on civilian populations. And that's not what the military is for. And this is another point I actually made last week, because I've often said that these guys need to be shut down. And the point I made last week is that it's not that I just want to go and blow up the agencies non-violently. It's that I think they need to return to their actual charters, because I'd be okay with that. I would be totally fine with these agencies just doing what they were formed to do. And if they stuck to that, I would never have become a journalist or an activist. Because it was their targeting of me that drove me down the path of finding out information about them, what they're doing, and then telling people about it. If they're going to spy on other spies, I'm okay with that. If they're going to spy on foreign diplomats or whatever, because the other foreign diplomats have spies spying on them, I'm okay with that too. What I'm not okay with, if they want to spy on actual terrorists who have actual guns and actual weapons and are actually going to hurt people, I'm okay with that too. I'm not okay with them spying on people who are engaged in protected democratic activities that we've been told all our lives living in democracies are our right to employ and are what make us different and better than countries that aren't democracies. We've always been told, but we have the right to protest. We have the right to seek redress against our government. When you take those things away, you're not a democracy anymore. And that's exactly what's happened. So it's not just that I'm anti-spy, it's that I'm anti-abuse by spies. I'm anti-
It's a good point. It's a good point. I mean, people who want to argue for intelligence agencies, and for a place for intelligence agencies in democracies, it's in their interests to bring transparency to the things that we're talking about here, that are anti-democratic and that are, seeking to shut down essentially political opposition and political competition, which is what democracies are founded on. So you're right. It's not just about being anti-spies. It's about intelligence agencies being democratically accountable and operating in ways that are consistent with democratic rights and freedoms and the law. I'm not sure what legal framework enable the stuff we're talking about here. I mean, you'd think it would just be fraudulent, if nothing else,
Yeah, they need to live up to the label that's on the box, and the label said, will not target own citizenry. Like foreign intelligence service. Foreign intelligence service means foreign intelligence service. It doesn't mean we target our own citizens en masse. Like, that's just ridiculous. They've, as Snowden said many times, they're creating a system of control. That's about controlling the population and controlling the society and controlling the restricting our ability to progress as a society. And that's deeply offensive. It's deeply anti-democratic and deeply offensive. And they've created their own opposition, because every time that they overstep their mark, every time that they engage in these abuses, ultimately there will be people like me that, instead of running scared, will go, hey, what you're doing is not okay, and I'm going to tell everyone it's not okay, and I'm going to dedicate my life to making sure that you know as well that it's not okay and that you can't keep doing it to people. It's despicable. Okay, we could talk about this all night.
Yes.
We're already over an hour through, so let's get back to the JTRIG slides, because I do think this is so important what's in them. And really, we're still at the intro almost. Okay. So, online covert action accreditation. So here is their manual for online covert action. And these are the 3 columns that you're talking about earlier. So in the first column is online human intelligence. I'll just try and make this bigger for you, right? And the second column, influence and information operations. And in the third column, disruption and computer network attacks. So, magic techniques and experiments. So, in online human intelligence, this is targeted at an individual or at a group or global. Global. Now, global is a word that you find all the way through the NSA documents. They call their behemoth organization of intelligence agencies in nearly 100 countries that are partnered with them the global network. When they talk about introducing new systems or new solutions, they always use the word global, deployed globally, networked globally. When they talk about wanting visibility in like geospatial terms, they talk about global awareness, wanting to be able to see what's happening on every inch of the globe, the physical territory of the globe. This word just comes up always over and over again, global, global, global. So that shows you what their sphere of thinking is. Their control that they want to have is total control, global control. And we're seeing that right here, because here's the individual that they go after and try and smear. Here's the group that they try to splinter or fracture or divert or control. And here is the global operations. So how they do that? They do it with the influence and information operations. And this is definitely your column to chat about, Melissa.
And the left one as well. When we go down there, there's lots of psychological terms in both of those columns.
Okay, do you want to start with a broad overview and then we'll go down to the breakdown of it?
Yeah, look, I agree with what you said. I mean, to me, the left-hand side's kind of about intelligence gathering and about the assessment, getting the lay of the land. The middle columns, essentially, the psychological operations, the manipulation. That's sort of the meat of most of it. The first 2 columns are, and then the right-hand columns, the technical aspects. And I guess, we'll see at another slide further down how sort of broad this project is. They talk about at the individual level sending individualized text messages all the way to propaganda through the media. So it's from, very individual one-to-one to mass communication, on a global scale. So it's a very broad scope.
And then on the third column, the disruption and computer network attacks, they talk about professionalism, elegance, creativity, and intuition. Now, my take on that, and particularly where it relates to elegance, we've spoken about how in NSA slides, these guys they are absolutely focused on never getting caught. So I think what elegance means to them is deniability. Deniability is an obsession of the NSA and the global network, the Five Eyes. So if they're going to perform any type of network intrusion or intrusion into your device, they want to be able to dress it up as being something other than it is. And this can be very simple in terms of like Occupy Auckland Twitter account got hacked, and when it was hacked, all the tweets were deleted, and instead it started tweeting out tweets in Russian language obsessively. And what is the likelihood of the Russian intelligence services deciding that they wanted to go after a Occupy in New Zealand and then showing that it was them by posting Russian political crap all over the Twitter account? Not very likely, actually, that it was them at all. But whoever actually did do it was able to use that as a method of distraction and as a cover and as a method of deniability to mask who it may have been. And it could have been New Zealand that did it. It could have been any of the Five Eyes that did it. It could have been Israel that did it. It could have been anyone, and we'll never know, because all we know is that we have a Twitter timeline full of Russian stuff in Cyrillic, and that's exactly what I'm talking about. They would consider something like that to be elegance. That to them is an elegant operation because they've successfully masked the source of the intrusion and of the attack, and they've achieved the outcome they wanted, which was to deny us access to our account and the ability, and of course Twitter never restored it to us, to deny us access to the account and the ability to communicate our messages. So that probably also is where the creativity ties in as well.
That makes sense.
Professionalism I just take to mean the way that they operate in their team structures, same with NSA, they run actual development teams as if they were, regular software developers. It's just that they happen to be building systems for the military that do nasty things, but they do actually operate in the same, using the same types of dynamics as a corporate or a private sector team. And you see that in the intelligence agencies referring to themselves as businesses. They call themselves the business, and they call themselves the corporation, because there actually is an NSA corporation, and they function exactly as if they're a private enterprise business, even though they're actually not supposed to be.
And with that example you were just giving, if people find it far-fetched, the idea that there would be, I guess that's essentially a false flag operation, the supporting documents to this talk openly about conducting false flags. So it's not at all conspiracist or fantasist to...
Oh, absolutely. And even beyond that, in the CVs of these intelligence operatives, which are on icwatch.wikileaks.org, go to icwatch.wikileaks.org and type false flag, and you can find hundreds of people saying, I performed false flag operations for this government department during this year, targeting these people associated with this mission. It's all there. They reference it openly in their CVs. So yeah, we're way past the point of conspiracy theory on that front. Okay, so heading back to our slides. Our next slide is now breaking that down, and I think this one I'm really going to have to zoom in, and we're going to have to take it piece by piece because it is massive. So now we still have those same three columns, but they're breaking it down for us. I'm not sure, I don't think I can make it bigger than this. Let's see if I can. Here we go.
Yeah, so these slides really get into the nitty-gritty of the psychological tactics that they're talking about.
Okay, so I'll let you speak to this. So
I mean, there's so much. It's a busy slide. If I was doing this presentation, I wouldn't make a slide this busy.
One thing I'd be really interested to know is, do these acronyms mean anything to you? Personality, Ocean.
Yeah. So
please, if you could break that down, that would be really helpful.
Well, that's very important, very timely. I mean, that was at the heart of all of the Cambridge Analytica activity. So Ocean refers to the most commonly used personality measure and way of understanding and organising personality research. So it's a questionnaire that assesses personality along 5 dimensions. O stands for openness, C stands for conscientiousness, E stands for extroversion, A stands for agreeableness, and N stands for neuroticism. So it's very widely used in psychology. So what they're talking about there, when they say remote assessment in digital cues, there's a big literature now. Some of it's in the public domain, some of it's private. SCL, Cambridge Analytica's parent company, has, and it's like I was saying before, it's possible to put together personality profiles for people based on their digital footprint. So you might as well fill out a questionnaire assessing your personality, and it means that whether it's a big data firm or an intelligence firm has information on your personality profile. So how open you are, how open to new experiences, whether you like novelty and diversity and tend to be more open-minded and exploring new ideas, that you'd be high on openness. Or if you're low on openness, you'd be more, prefer predictability and familiarity and the known and the familiar. Conscientiousness, if you're high on conscientiousness, you're very sort of organised and goal-directed and, diligent. If you're low on conscientiousness, you're more kind of free-flowing and spontaneous. Extroversion, we all know what that is. Agreeableness, if you're high on agreeableness, you're warm and compassionate, friendly. Low on agreeableness, you're more suspicious, more likely to be antagonistic. So, it's a spectrum from one to the other, and we're all sort of bits of everything, but people do tend to sort of lean either high or low or moderate on these things. And neuroticism also gets called emotional stability. So it's, if you're high on neuroticism, you're just sort of more emotional, more prone to getting stressed and or anxious, depressed, just any kind of emotionality. Low on neuroticism, negative emotionality, low on neuroticism, just more kind of even-keeled, unruffable, that kind of thing. So, people who, for instance, are high on agreeableness and conscientiousness are more susceptible to pressures of conformity. People high on neuroticism are more easily frightenable. People high on openness are inclined to lean left. People low on openness inclined to lean right. So they're saying there how to apply these. So that's, whoever is gathering information on you, gathering individualized information on what's likely to be a most effective tactic to use. So here, who are my motives, and exploiting them. So there they are, using just saying it out loud that they're planning to exploit your personality. And so, on the other side, you see building trust.
Could you give us sorry to interrupt you, Lisa. That was a brilliant and fascinating and edifying explanation you just gave for the OCEAN acronym. But now put yourself in the shoes of an FBI profile or whoever it is that is their job is, okay, they've now assessed a target's personality profile. How would they exploit someone who's high on openness? How would they exploit someone who's low on openness? How would they, and for each of those, how, because you said it's a spectrum, that infers that there must be different methods of targeting dependent on where on the spectrum someone is.
Well, the honest truth about that is that the psychology profession doesn't have really fine-grained knowledge about that. And the reality of personality is it's usually a weak to moderate predictor of people's behaviour because, although, say, one of us, we might tend towards high openness in different situations, that would be different. On the other hand, the private data companies have a lot more information, it seems, than psychology does about that because it's, as I was saying before, been collected in the context of, the 2016 election and Brexit. But just broadly, roughly, and it's a very approximate science based on what psychology knows, but there's more information behind that corporate intelligence veil that's not available to the rest of us. So in fact, there are experiments run on this in targeting advertising to people. So someone high on openness would be, more influenced by something that was making something seem really sort of new, novel, interesting, progressive. They, tend to be attracted to difference, to new experiences. So things would be framed in those terms. Someone low on openness, you'd frame things more in terms of traditionality, being predictable, being safe, being comfortable, being familiar. So you'd emphasise different things. Conscientiousness, you'd emphasise sort of duty, responsibility, success, achievement. For someone who's high on conscientiousness, someone who's low on conscientiousness, you'd make something appealing on the grounds of being, kind of just fun and free and easy. Extroversion, I mean, there's an experiment that psychologists conducted tailoring ads for makeup for people high and low on extroversion. So the ads targeted to the extroverts had a picture of a woman dancing, and it said, dance like no one's watching, although they totally are, and she looks like she's having a great time. And then the ad targeted to the person low on extroversion had a woman sitting looking in the mirror with very subtle makeup saying, beauty doesn't have to be loud, was the caption. So when they showed that ad to people high on extroversion, got a lot of clicks, but not low on extroversion, the extroverted ad. When they showed the more subdued ad, it got lots of clicks from people low on extroversion. So that's an example. So with agreeableness. So somebody high on agreeableness wants to be friendly, wants to be helpful, you'd appeal to that. Can you help me with this? That, appealing for cooperation, for support. Someone low on agreeableness, more suspicious, more kind of hostile and aggressive, you might appeal to them more by being angry about something, or being retaliation against something or someone.
Sorry to interrupt again, but I'm just now dying to ask. Are people who are angry and suspicious attracted to other people who are angry and suspicious? Like, would they be more likely to trust someone who reflects the same characteristics?
Yes, in general, that is one of the principles of attractiveness and liking. I'm trying to look around the slide to see where that is. On one of these slides, they talk about a researcher called Cialdini. Yeah, and he talks about the 6 principles of persuasion, which is intended for marketing and sales, but one of those is likability, and so there's a bunch of ways that you get someone to like you. People are far more influenced by someone they like and perceive as a friend, and one of the main ways to, there's several, but one of them is similarity. People tend to find people who they perceive as similar, having similar values, similar goals, similar preferences, as more likable and more attractive. So this would definitely help, an influence operative to make themselves more likable. They'd be able to sort of make a good educated guess as to how to make themselves appear similar to the target. Yeah.
Wow. And it says here, decisions, emotional, not rational.
So that's, and it's probably a reason that that's right up the top there. Although most of us perceive our decision-making and our information processing to be rational and to be based on, weighing up of information, in reality, a lot of it, in fact, most of it is very emotion-driven, unless we're consciously or unconsciously motivated to be accurate and factual. We tend to gravitate towards information that fits with our feelings about things. So they talk about in cognition literature feeling first and thinking later, reason sort of being a gun for hire in service of emotion. So if we like something, we'll take on and absorb, believe, remember information that's positive. If we don't like, if we feel negative towards something, we'll take on and remember and believe information that's derogatory. And that's a sort of simple explanation of it. So manipulating people's perceptions and their beliefs is all about manipulating the emotions. Once you do that, once you can manipulate how somebody feels about something, it's relatively easy to feed information and alter beliefs and decisions. I mean, all cognition, decision, reality perception, belief formation, problem solving, it's all very, very emotion driven.
So, and under behaviour and influence, it says Hofstede dimensions. What are they?
That's talking about cross-cultural differences. So it's actually it's not that highly regarded in psychology, mainly because it's not very good at predicting individuals, and the data was gathered on IBM employees, so largely middle-class male sample. But some of the dimensions are useful. There's one that's used quite a lot in psychology is that cultures differ on their degree of individualism and collectivism. So in individualistic societies, which Western societies are much more than some Asian and Latin American societies, the individual welfare is prioritised over the collective, whereas in collectivist societies, the collective welfare is prioritised over the individual. So I think this is talking about being aware of those differences across cultures. Another Hofstede dimension is essentially sort of traditionalism versus progressivism. Is change valued, or is tradition and staying true to the past valued? Another one, which I think is increasingly relevant to the West, is I think they call it intolerance of uncertainty or ambiguity. So how much does the culture embrace differences of opinion, political opinion, differences of ideas, allow different ideologies to coexist? How much does the culture insist on one version of truth? I think I would argue in the West we used to be high on the tolerance of diversity and ambiguity in ideas, and we're moving more towards low on that, according to these Hofstede dimensions. There's another one they talk about is masculinity and femininity. Maybe in the days before that would have been considered sexist, which is how much does the culture value, traditionally masculine, stereotypically masculine qualities like, authority and activity and dominance versus cooperation and affiliation and care. So, and they say interaction across cultures. So I guess along with personality, they're wanting their influences to be aware of cultural differences. Is there another part you'd like me to start talking about, Susie?
I think the group dynamics are really key. Because I have got endless stories about the ways in which I've seen these things be directly employed. For example, group, right? In the virtual communities, they want to assess the motives, the roles, influence, and cascade, but they use conspiracy stories. Conspiracy stories we see individually and as a group. So, for example, my most recent group of e-stalkers, for want of a better term, have created these entire blog sites with this whole conspiracy narrative that I ran away from New Zealand with $1 million and I'm secretly rich and therefore I don't need anyone to donate to me and don't need money and I'm not facing any hardship because actually I have $1 million and just these types of things where they invent these like alternate reality and alternate motives and then assign them to me in order to discredit me with my support base. You can see the conspiracy stories with Snowden. Snowden's actually secretly working for the CIA and was a CIA operation to discredit the NSA. You can see the conspiracy stories with Julian and with WikiLeaks. WikiLeaks is a Mossad operation. WikiLeaks is a CIA operation. WikiLeaks is a Russian operation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And to me, conspiracy stories are where people claim to have some access to some hidden knowledge. The whole QAnon would be a classic example at a group where it's being deployed across a group level. You know, we have access to information that you don't have access to, and therefore we know the truth that you don't know, and therefore you should adopt our beliefs and our narratives because we know more than you do. And they seed these conspiracies and use them to attempt to influence people. So that's just a couple of off-the-cuff examples that I would give.
Yeah, that makes sense. Because when I was looking at that, I was wondering what they were talking about exactly with conspiracy stories, but right next to the group stuff, that does make sense. So, and the one they've got in the middle there, social identity theory, that's a very influential theory in psychology, which just talks about the fact that, people, to a greater or lesser degree, but most people quite strongly derive quite a bit of their identity and their sense of worth and value from their group belongings. And in order to enhance their sense of worth and value, people engage in a process of intergroup competition, in a way, psychological competition. So they compare their group with others, and it's a very, very, very robust finding in psychology that even if you divide people into groups based on utterly meaningless criteria like colour of your T-shirt, and even if it's people you've never met before, people perceive the other group as inferior. They'll do comparisons and perceive their group as superior on all sorts of qualities: trustworthiness, intelligence, capability, etc., etc. So it's a very easily exploited process. The H.B. Gary emails about targeting WikiLeaks talked about that, about exploit natural fractures within the community. So you can hive people off and divide and conquer really easily. So, I mean, this is kind of in the assessment side roughly. So it looks like, although they're talking about interventions there as well, but it looks like they're wanting to assess virtual communities. What are the groups? What are the roles? What are the motives? I mean, when they're talking about an influence cascade, people are, so part of this, it sounds like, isn't just about fracturing groups, but it's about using groups to influence people. I'm assuming that's what they're talking about with the influence cascade.
Would it be like the attack on Nils Melzer, where one person writes, Nils shouldn't be in his position because ABC, and then gets a second person and a third person to sign on, and then that becomes a dozen people, and now it's 100 people, and now it's, 500 of my colleagues around the world have signed this, therefore it's safe for me to sign my name to it because now I'm in agreement with the group. Is that an example of a cascade effect?
Yeah, that would be, because that could exploit groups around gender and around feminism. So people who related as a feminist to that critique or as a woman, that tugs on that group identity, that tugs on that social identity theory. I'm a feminist.
See, I would think that in the first 12 or 20 or 50 people, that might be why they sign on. But what I'm wondering is, when they get to the 200 people, and now they're reading the list of names before they're reading the actual post, and they feel safe to sign on. Maybe they didn't even read the post, but because XYZ have signed it, therefore they would sign on to it.
Yes, and that's what they're talking about with social proof and herding in that third green rectangle there. So, I mean, what that's referring to is that people look to their groups that they perceive themselves as belonging in for how to behave. And it's a very strong tendency that people, especially if their identity is tied up in their group belonging, they will go along with whatever the group's doing.
And I would say in the professional classes, absolutely.
Yes. Yeah, there's a lot of herding. I mean, you can see herding in the media, in professional classes, absolutely. You don't sort of say what's not the done thing to say, and all right thinking people will think a certain thing, and so you better think that if you want to be a right thinking professional. It's a very strong human impulse. So, and it's easily manipulated. I mean, some of the studies that they draw on in the persuasion literature are things like if you go to a hotel and there's a card and it says please recycle your towels or please reuse your towels, I mean, that's sort of moderately effective. If you say 80% of people who stay at this hotel reuse their towels, it goes up because you think, other people do it. Well, then people are much more likely to do it. If you say 80% of people who stay in this room reuse the towels, almost everybody reuses the towels, because it's that thing of people like me do this, therefore I'm going to do it. So it's got a few different names, but it's, they call it herding, social proof, consensus, or descriptive
That
norms. But
is
it's a very, very
fascinating.
powerful, a very powerful thing. Yeah.
That is absolutely fascinating.
Yeah. So if you just, if you know that someone's, you can tell from their digital footprint that they identify strongly as a feminist, or they care a lot about gender equality, or you need to say give them the message that all right-thinking feminists believe blah, then that's powerful. So I mean, it can happen with any group belonging. I mean, you see it a lot with right and left. I mean, especially just after Donald Trump was elected, there was a lot of, on the left, you better not be seen to say this and you better not be seen to say that. And certain words are off limits. Otherwise, that means you're on the right. And people, when they have their social identity strongly tied up with, being on the left, or, being an American or Australian or whatever it is, they're very motivated not to be seen to be a member of an out-group, is what psychologists call it. So another way to target, so, there's two sort of targets here. There's the target for grooming to get the person to turn on someone or smear someone or attack someone, and there's the target who's being smeared. A good way to get people to turn on or smear a target is to define them as an out-group member. So for people on the left, define them as being on the right. For people, who are feminist or egalitarian, define them as being racist or sexist. It's very, very, very powerful to get people on board with smear campaigns and discreditation and the kinds of things we're talking about here.
Absolutely. I mean, we saw that with Unity for J. We had erroneous accusations of that we were neo-Nazi, that we're white supremacists, that we're fascists, that et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I remember exactly the same thing happening with Occupy. With Occupy, there was what was probably a false flag operation where somebody who was reported to be part of our group, though we'd never seen them or knew anything about them, defaced some headstones at the Jewish cemetery, and then was reported in the media that Occupy have defaced headstones at the Jewish cemetery, and therefore they're neo-Nazi, fascist, white supremacists, etc. We saw it with Anonymous, and the Anonymous hacktivist group were depicted as being neo-Nazi, fascist, white supremacist, even though they were running operations against the KKK and taking down KKK websites. In reality, they were reported as being neo-Nazi sympathizers. This seems to be a recycled tactic against any major social movement. They try to divide them on those grounds, or to deter people from joining the movement on those grounds.
Well, that's a very powerful thing, because people would do almost anything other than be shunned by groups that they care about belonging in. And in the brain, when people are ostracized by groups, even groups that aren't tied up with their identity, but even more so groups that are tied up with their identity, the parts of the brain that fire off when you're in physical pain fire off when you're ostracized from a group. So it's a very strong deterrent. If somebody thinks that supporting that person means I'll be ostracized from my group, it's a very good way to either make people keep their mouths shut and go along with the vilification, or join in for greater group belonging.
So next to group dynamics, it says they're looking to reduce the group effectiveness, and then that links to agenticity and patternicity. What on earth are those?
I'm not 100% sure why agenticity and patternicity are right there. It might be random. So that's what we were talking about before with respect to religion. So it's the idea that when people see, that would relate more to the conspiracy stories, actually, which may relate back.
What is? I'm unfamiliar with both terms. So what is agenticity?
So when you see or are confronted with a random set of data or information, the brain is wired to find patterns and to look for meaning, even if it's utterly random and meaningless. So patternicity is seeing patterns in things, seeing connections between things, and agenticity is seeing a living being in things, like seeing the hand of God behind natural events, or what I think of when I think of agenticity is that idea in the, the hand of the market. The free market has this benevolent hand that's going to, it's going to deliver beneficence to the world. That's a sort of a slight, so that's playing on that agenticity. I mean, it's used to explain belief in God. That's what I was talking before about with belief in God. So an experiment that's done with that is you show people some triangles and squares moving randomly around a screen, and people will turn it into a story, like it's a man chasing a woman and that's, her boyfriend trying to fight him off. That's one of the experiments they do, that people tend to make a story out of it. It's a bit like anthropomorphizing, and it's so common that if that doesn't happen, it's taken as a sign of a cognitive impairment. So I guess that I think they're talking possibly about exploiting that by seeding conspiracy stories or making people believe what they want to believe. If there's confusing information, if you help people to make sense of it in a certain way, they'll latch onto that. I think that's what they're talking about there. And well, you talked about QAnon before. I think QAnon's an example of agenticity. Trust the plan. It seems like a cruel, confusing, horrible persecution, but no, there's a benevolent force behind it. Trust the plan. Donald Trump will rescue.
And actually, QAnon employs both agenticity and patternicity in the sense that they're all about recognize the patterns, this happened and that happened. Oh yeah, absolutely. That's almost the core of the movement. Is Q posted 147268, and look what happened on the 14th of July, and it's like they're always trying to create patterns all the time, and also the agenticity, because QAnon also pushes the spiritual aspect. So they're like, this is a spiritual war, it's good versus evil, it's blah blah blah, we have God on our side, blah blah blah.
Yeah. Well, that sounds exactly like them. That's what that's about. Yeah, trying to exploit agenticity and patternicity.
Wow. So under global here, I mean, this might be the most alarming in terms of affecting everybody part of this of this spreadsheet. I don't think the viewers would be able to see this, and I'm having to really squint at my screen to see it myself. But under global, it says constructing news systems, and then it says the financial ecosystem of media. Do you want to speak to that? Do you want me to have a go at it?
Well, you can have a go. I mean, that's not really technical and psychological. To me, that's just talking about applying this stuff on a mass scale through the media and going via, the funding. I mean, the financial ecosystem of media is pretty easy to exploit because, it relies on advertising dollars and so on. So, but, you go ahead. That's my main take on it. That it's about essentially what we're talking about here is doing this on a smaller scale to groups and individuals, and that looks like it's talking more about mass propaganda.
Exactly. And that comes back to these strategic influence operations on a global scale. Constructing news systems says to me, I mean, you could call it a false flag operation, because that's really what it is when they're pretending to be something other than what they actually are. They're not a news system at all. Broadcast system would be accurate, because they're broadcasting in misinformation, tainted information to a population. But to me, constructing news systems means that they're trying to establish credibility, as, again, it's about cover. So they are acting as something that they actually aren't, and they're doing it for a purpose other than the stated purpose of, like they'll say, this is news, we are circulating news. Actually, they're not circulating news, as you said, they're circulating propaganda, and it's that combination of hidden motive but also establishing credibility, because news services have credibility. News services trade based on credibility, and so that to me says that there may be entire, and actually, now that I think about that, is that not Bellingcat? I mean, Bellingcat would be a classic example, and it even ties into the financial ecosystem of media. Now you have you have media which are receiving contracts from NATO, which the military are giving millions of dollars to. Is this not the white helmets, for
I was
example?
just thinking of the white helmets.
Exactly. I mean, that's that combination of dressing propaganda as news and using economics to support it.
It's more out in the open now than it was in 2011 when these slides were put together. I mean, there were so many ex-CIA directors and officers and so on in CNN. And
look, you're spot on. You're spot on. That's another direct combination where they're addressing themselves as news services. All of these, Brennan of all people on MSNBC, sitting there as on a news channel, on a news hour, speaking what's supposed to be newsworthy information, actual credible information, using the credibility of the network and the outlet. And there you go again, there's the financial ecosystem aspect, being paid to do so and generating profit for the corporation in doing so. Absolutely. Okay. I'm quite cognizant of the fact that we have now been going for 2 hours and we are less than 1/3 of the way through these slides. However, I don't want to just breeze through these. I don't want to go, we've been here for 2 hours, therefore we're going to skip through a few slides. To be honest, I've wanted to do this ever since I first read those, the JTRIG, the original JTRIG files and the original JTRIG reporting, but I didn't have Lissa K. Johnson to come and give the other side of it, because when I study, and I talk about this a lot in Decipher You, where I'm reading through Snowden Files live online, we've done thousands of them, I am very aware of what I don't know and what I don't understand and what I don't have the expertise or the experience to speak to. And there's a lot of that in the Snowden Files, especially when it's the actual systems and systems architecture stuff. I understand the general business terminology, I understand the software development terminology, but I don't understand it in the military and targeting context. And that's why I've had sat down with people like Bill Binney and done work around that, because other people have got the experience and expertise that I lack. In the context of the JTRIG files, you are teaching me, Lissa, as we're going through this. I'm learning from you. I've learned a humongous amount tonight, as well as our viewers hopefully learning something from both of us. But I have felt in me ever since this original reporting on the JTRIG files that these are some of the most important files that have probably ever been in open circulation in the public, and particularly for the time that we live in. Where we are
extremely relevant to the time that we live in.
Exactly, extremely relevant and increasingly relevant, because there is increasing investment into this field. There's increasing numbers of agents, of private companies, of government sponsorship, and of targets, people being affected by it and influenced and impacted by it. So what I'm wondering is, and I know that I'm springing this on you live, would you be willing to come back? Because I want to do this justice. I feel that this little enterprise of you and I working together on this is going to be something that people are going to refer back to for years to come, and I know I will myself.
Well, the slides are very dense. I mean, each one of those words is a huge research literature in itself, so it makes sense if you be taking time to go through them. So yes, no, I'd be delighted to come back and keep going through them. And I guess, that way we're not overloading people with an enormous amount of
For sure. Okay, well, let's try and get through the rest of this slide for tonight, because this is one of the meatiest slides in the entire package. And then let's reconvene for a part 2 of deciphering the JTRIG files. Okay, so we've covered off the first column, and now the second column, the influence and information operations. And here we go, psychology of trust and deception and persuasive tech. That's very interesting.
Yeah, I mean, persuasive techniques, I think, would be what they're talking about. So, yeah, one stream of this is about talking about building relationships and building trust, which is really at the heart of a lot of the other techniques. So, in the green boxes in the middle, they say building relationships, mirroring, mimicry, social penetration theory. So that's all about basically pretending to be someone's friend, faking your way into someone perceiving you as their friend. And they talk about that in the accompanying documents, that one of the goals is to befriend people. I'll start at the bottom. So, and that's the way to build trust, obviously, is people trust those that they perceive as their friends. And they're much more open to all of the influence techniques from friends. And, one of the, as we were talking about before, main influence techniques is making yourself likable and attractive to somebody. So social penetration theory is, it's pretty obvious. It's not rocket science, but I guess it's a sort of paint by numbers way to become closer to somebody. So the idea of social penetration theory is that as people move from strangers to acquaintances to friends to good friends to having a close relationship, they move through layers of self-disclosure. So it starts with some disclosure of personal information, how you feel about something about your background, just something personal, and that as you get closer to someone, that level of self-disclosure gets gradually deeper and covers a broader range of topics. So that's what social penetration theory is talking about. And there are a few details of it that would help someone to pretend to befriend you when it wasn't real, a sort of recipe they could follow, and that is that the self-disclosure needs to be reciprocal. So you disclose, the other person discloses, it goes gradually deeper. And also that when people disclose to each other, it's not enough to just disclose in return. You need to sort of show that you've heard, that you get them, validate the experience, like, oh, no wonder you felt like that, or I feel like that too, or I've had that experience, and show that you care about it. And then that will encourage the person to then disclose again, because they've been heard, they feel you get them, they feel you care about them. So, that's actually quite a sinister thing to have in there. That's probably one of the creepiest boxes on there, because it is about tricking people into thinking you like them and care about them and getting them to open up to you. Another way to do that is mirroring and mimicry, which is, I talk about this in more detail on one of the other slides, but that when people are friends, when people are interacting in peer groups, not across sort of social groups, like not bosses with, employees, but if you're in the same kind of peer group, people tend to adopt each other's way of speaking and adopt each other's mannerisms, turns of phrase. So on another slide, they talk about doing that, about mirroring a person, speaking in a similar way to them. That will help them feel like, you're on the same page. They'll feel more like you're a friend than a stranger. So that's, and actually in the accompanying document written by a psychologist to explain this, she talks about the influencers being aware of where they are in this process of building relationships and adjust their influence attempts accordingly. So how much trust is there? How close is the relationship? How far has it progressed? That's obviously something they keep track of and monitor. Other ways that aren't mentioned here, but they talk about it or reference it on other slides. Liking. There's 6 principles of persuasion by a guy called Cialdini, which they talk about on another slide. And one of them is liking, get people to like you. So as well as these tactics, the other ways to get people to like each other are to depict yourself as part of the same group, and especially if you're part of the same social group working towards a goal, it creates a sense of sort of togetherness, and they call it we-ness. Flattering people is another powerful, surefire way to get them to like you. So these are all things that will be going on in terms of, I guess, kind of grooming someone, befriending someone. And I mean, the difficult thing with this is it's mimicking what people do when they genuinely want to get to know you and when you're genuinely becoming friends with someone. So I would advise against being suspicious of any of this if it's happening online. It's the thing to be aware of is, I guess, what's being asked of you in the context of a friendship. Is it something that you would do just off your own bat? Just stay really anchored in your own priorities, your own values. Be aware of your group-based processes, your personality vulnerabilities. Are those being tugged on to get you to do or say something that isn't exactly you, rather than being suspicious of everybody. And, you know,
well, I think there's different contexts. There's different contexts in which this is in which people are trying to obtain this information. So there's the marketing context, which is that you're going to subconsciously give away a lot of this just in your online behaviors. That's going to be collected. It's going to be collated with other big data sources, your credit card details, your insurance details, your medical history or whatever. And they're going to build what a wonderful researcher in Berlin calls a glass mask of you, which is this profile of you that is built off all of this aggregated data, the data from social networks, the data from corporations, and the data from government, et cetera, et cetera. So that you can't really counter and deliver authentically. You could create fake profiles of yourself and click on a bunch of stuff you don't care about and whatever else. But that's stuff that inevitably, one way or another, you're going to give away about yourself. But the exploitation is for commercial gain. It's not actually to hurt your feelings, destroy your life, right? It's when these principles are used against you to target you as an individual, to cause harm, direct harm to you, to your relationships, to your opportunities, to your life, that it becomes particularly toxic. So I just want to make that differential there.
Yeah, and those green boxes are about pretending to be a friend, basically. And it's hard. It's very hard to tell when someone's pretending, because it's the same thing that someone would do who really is becoming your friend. It's difficult to differentiate. So I think it's best not to be mistrustful. Just keep an open mind, especially online. If it's someone you don't know them offline, you don't know who they really are. Just keep an open mind if you're an activist who could be being targeted in these ways, and don't assume that you're being manipulated, but just wait and see what's asked of you in that context, I guess.
So in that context of you being individually targeted by an online human intelligence operative, they either want information or they want action or they want both. So that's the point at which and it's going to be in the context, usually it's going to be in the context of you either being associated with a targeted group or being an activist or a dissident or a journalist or something like this. Though there is also the social engineering side, where it's that you work for a company and they're interested in whatever, they want something in relation to that company. But they're either going to want information from you or they're going to want some action out of you. If the only information that they ever get from you is what you like and what you don't like and whatever else, and your personality profile, but they don't get the information or the action out of you, then that's going to be mostly wasted time for them.
Exactly.
So it's watching out for where that transition point is, where the transition point from learning about each other and forming a relationship and getting involved in whatever capacity with each other, to them now wanting you to do stuff, or them wanting information, actionable intelligence from you. So that I would think would be where your heckles would be raised.
And being careful about what you give away about yourself online to people you don't actually know. I mean, I think it's good practice if you're communicating online, just assume that it could be read by anybody. Assume it is being read. like lots of people. You know what I mean? So, and if you don't know who the person is, it's a Twitter handle or a Facebook account or whatever it is. This social penetration theory is all about getting you to self-disclose and reveal personal things about yourself. So it's probably worth just being mindful.
Right, and it doesn't really discuss it in this slide, but they will use those disclosures as a weapon, right? So this is very interesting because it's one of the things that I learned early on when I was an activist, is that self-disclosure, public disclosure is actually one of the most powerful things that you can do, is to own your skeletons and your secrets, and not ever to present yourself as being other than you are, because in doing so you actually inoculate yourself from others being able to manipulate, threaten, or blackmail you as a result of anything. So I'm thinking there was a famous case actually where Jamie Kilstein wrote a post years ago when he was still considered a progressive activist, talking about his rampant alcoholism and saying, I am an alcoholic, I'm self-disclosing, I am an alcoholic, I have this tendency, I have that symptom, I have this that I do that's a negative behavior as a result. And he actually said in that post that being an activist, and particularly in the wake of Occupy Wall Street, that he felt that self-disclosure about his alcoholism was one of the most powerful things that he could do, because he didn't want to have his weaknesses be exploited or to have that held against him or used against him. He would rather come forward and talk about it himself. And that for me was really super powerful. That was a really powerful object lesson, because you can only be blackmailed with something that you're scared about being found out. If you take control and power over the reality of who you are, your history, your life story, your situation, you own that and you front foot it, nobody can use that against you. And so I just point that out to people as well.
That's a good point. Yeah.
So what is this priming and anchoring? I mean, I think hindsight bias and confirmation bias are pretty self-explanatory, right? Confirmation bias, they'll drip feed you information which can appear on the surface to confirm information that you already held to be true. Hindsight bias, where you're looking back and going, this is something I've got to say that gets used against me quite often, the hindsight bias, which is that they will feed you some information that doesn't make sense, and then they'll feed you some information that makes the information that doesn't make sense make sense. It's also seen right throughout the QAnon stuff. So QAnon will post some nonsense, and then some event will happen, and they'll go back and they have a catchphrase with QAnon: future proves past. This is what they call it. They call it future proves past, and the idea is that the veracity of QAnon is proven by a future event that validates the past event. And the intimation is that the past event knew all along that the future event would occur. But in reality, Q will post like Blue Lotus aeroplane something, and then next thing, like 2 months down the track, there'll be something that was blue that had an aeroplane in it, and there's some Lotus reference, and then they'll go, aha, Q knew 2 months ago that this was going to happen. Future proves past, future proves past. And they chant it like a mantra: future proves past, future proves past.
It's like a blend of confirmation bias and hindsight bias.
Yeah, absolutely.
Hindsight bias is they call it the knew it all along effect. So you
exactly. It's like crystal, and it's like the crystal. Q is the crystal ball, but you have to wait to find out what the crystal ball is actually saying.
And confirmation bias just is that people are more open to information that confirms their existing, beliefs and worldviews and so on. Yeah.
So priming and anchoring, what is this?
Priming. Look, priming, I mean, they're fairly simple ideas. Priming is just that, actually priming can be a bit more complex. Priming is, there's a whole book called Persuasion, which is basically about priming, and that's about laying the groundwork for your influence attempt.
Is it grooming?
Basically, yeah. So these three green boxes about building a relationship, that's a form of priming. You're laying the framework, the groundwork, something that goes before your influence attempt. So you're building trust, you're building liking, you're building, building a friendship.
Because I've said, sorry to interrupt you, I've said in the past, and this is my feeling from the perspective of a target, that the process of these operatives grooming you appears to me to be no different than the process of a pedophile grooming a child, except that you're not a child, you're an adult. That seems to be the only difference that I can come up with. They invest over a long period of time, gradually increasing contact, all of the "you're so beautiful, wonderful, etc., spectacular, special, you're special, you're special, it's a secret, don't tell anybody, can't tell anybody because of this reason or that reason, this bad thing might happen to us, but our relationship is so special," etc., etc., etc. It really does seem to me that a lot of what these guys do is just classic pedophile behavior, except that and I mean, it's actually not fair. It's not fair of me to say, except we're adults. I mean, I'm an adult, but there are documented cases of teenage activists who have been targeted by human intelligence in New Zealand. They targeted a 16-year-old activist, sexually targeted a 16-year-old activist. So it's not always that it is an adult, but the behavior the technique appears to me to be as if a pedophile is grooming a child.
Yeah. No, you're right about grooming. In fact, I was having that conversation with someone recently with respect to Julian Assange. And there's grooming of the victim, and then there's also grooming of the victim or the target's environment so that it supports the abuse. So, this could be talking about both of those. So that's a good example of priming. Or priming could also be creating a climate of fear, and people will be more open to influence that tugs on fear, whether that's being sort of offering a sense of safety, or when people are fearful, they're more conformist to their groups and they're more obedient to authority. So priming could refer to all sorts of things, but it's laying the groundwork for the influence attempt, including the kind of grooming you're talking about, not limited to that though. Anchoring is similar, but it's sort of right at the beginning of the influence attempt. So it's the idea that the first bit of information people receive has an undue amount of influence on what comes next in terms of their decision-making and their perception. Studies of this are, for instance, if a car salesman's, giving someone a spiel about a car and then he or she comes to the price, if they say, "Oh, look, I'm not going to charge you $1 million, it's only $75,000, people won't haggle with the price because you've anchored it at $1 million. So if you start with just the 75,000, people haggle it down. So that could be, I'm not 100% sure what they're talking about here. Maybe you have an idea, Susie, but I could imagine if having built a relationship and having, done the persuasion work, done the priming, anchoring an influence attempt on something extreme would make the request that you actually make, or the influence attempt that you actually make, seem less extreme. So if you say, well, it's not like we're talking about, it's not like we're talking about planting a bomb, just talking about blah. That might seem, that's no big deal compared to planting a bomb. Does that make sense to you?
Is anchoring a psychological term?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's the idea that the bit of information that comes first has undue influence on what comes next.
Okay, in that case, I'd defer to you, being that this is literally written under psychology, deception, and influence.
But if it's,
I would have thought of anchoring differently, but not because of any special knowledge that I have. I would have thought that anchoring is more like, I would have read it like cementing an idea by supplying additional information.
I can see how, that's not how it's used in psychology, but that makes sense. I'm sure that is something that happens. But that would be
it's more confirmation bias, probably.
It's similar, yeah. Well, it's influencing what people are open to, being conscious that the first bit of information you put in has a big amount of influence on what comes next, what people will be open to next. So if you anchor it at something extreme, they'll be more open to what comes next. But what you're talking about is probably more called consolidation. And this 10 principles of scams, maybe we could leave that because they've got a whole slide on the 10 principles of scams. So
okay, cool. Okay, great.
When we get to it, yeah.
So in performance, they've got how to act and behave and self-presentation in a cyber context.
Which I think is what we've just talked about, especially with the relationship building and the trust building, feeds into that. It just sounds like that's how to. They talk about creating online aliases, so I guess that's feeding into the online alias. That they need to be mindful of the group and what's going on in the group and where they want to enter the group.
What scared me about this conversation so far is something I hadn't considered before, which is that the idea that they're actually creating internally within their organizations metrics for their performance around the success or failure of their attempt to build relationships. And it's highly likely that from a business context, they absolutely are having some kind of metrics for this. When you were talking before about how far the relationship progressed, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, that starts to give me nightmares because, I mean, you can build, like from a software development perspective, reporting functions and metrics. I mean, this is a core principle. So you could very easily apply reporting functions and metrics to this. And given that these are hierarchical organizations, where they have some measure of internal accountability for expenditure of resource, including human resource and development hours, they probably do have some kind of measure of, a metrics system internally and that, to me, that's horrifying. That I mean, as if everything we're discussing isn't horrifying, but particularly the idea that they would actually sit there and and maybe even have some kind of automated metrics. I mean, good God.
Possible.
Internal reporting systems, how many hours spent with a target, how many goals achieved within a conversation with a target, frequency of goals, how many conversations it takes that don't achieve goals in order to get the conversation that does achieve a goal, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, there's all kinds of statistical applications that could be applied to this, which is, to do that to human relationships is just
awful. It really is awful. It's very exploitative. I mean, we're talking through it, but it's horrifically unethical. It's an awful exploitation of psychological knowledge. So profoundly unethical.
Actually, that's where I'd like to leave this conversation off. So I'm going to stop the screen share and we'll pick it up next time where we are now, because we're now at 2.5 hours. But I'd like to ask you one last question, and that is, as a clinical psychologist, how does it make you feel to know that your field and your colleagues are involved in creating a system of exploitation that is really, I mean, I would call this the bastardization of the human experience.
Well, you're right. Yeah, it is. And I think when we were talking before, you call it the weaponization of psychology, which it also is. Horrified, truly horrified. And, a bit mystified that it's gone so successfully under the radar. How has this been? I mean, I wasn't aware of it, but how's it been in the public domain for all these years? 5 years since that was leaked, that slide? Yes. And there's not mass outrage. The psychology profession has been alerted to the existence of these slides, because the psychologist who provided the background sort of brief as to what these slides were about and about applying them, is known. There are articles about it. Various psychologists referenced in the reference list, contacted for comment. Some said it's deeply unethical. Some said it's none of our business. It's up to governments to, regulate their intelligence agencies. But that's where it was left. So yeah, I find it appalling that it's not, not automatically an issue for the psychology profession to address and look at and express ethical opinions on and seek ethical accountability for how our knowledge and our information is being used. And I can understand psychologists who don't really understand what's going on, don't really understand that it's activists being targeted. Maybe they think, oh, it's just being used against pedophile rings and actual violent terrorists. I can understand not realising the fullness of the application of the knowledge. But I think, really we should be playing a bigger role in accountability for how our knowledge and our literatures are being used. And psychologists, the social psychology discipline knows that collective violence and collective abuse, which this is a collective activity, and it requires silent, passive bystanders. That's the bystanding literature is huge and very well understood and known within psychology. So while I understand people who don't really know what's going on, saying it's none of our business, it's up to governments to make sure psychological knowledge is used ethically. On the other hand, that makes us passive bystanders to the abuse and misuse of psychological knowledge, which I think we really should know better than to do. So what the answer is, I don't know. It took a lot of lobbying to get the American Psychological Association to take a stand against torture and against psychological involvement in abusive practices with intelligence and military around that. So that is probably what it would take around this issue. And I guess the first step is awareness. I don't think many people, certainly most psychologists and most people, don't even know of the existence of these slides. So, and they're, once you start to dig into them, they're shocking and horrifying.
So, are psychologists bound by the Hippocratic Oath, or is this?
Yeah, we have we have an extensive code of ethics which involves do no harm. So yeah, this absolutely violates that. I think the argument that psychologists put forward is that this is just knowledge that's out in the public domain.
Not at the point at which they can have consulting psychologists, though.
No, that's right. Yeah, I'm not sure how that could. Well, I think it depends whether a psychologist is registered as a practitioner. Our codes of ethics, at least in Australia, guide the behaviour of practitioners with their clients. So it's possible that there are ways around that, but I'm not sure how that works in the US. But since the revelations about torture, before that, there was a bit of a sort of an out for psychologists working with the military, that they kind of had an out from the code of ethics if they were putting it, in broad terms, but if they were working for the military. And then after the practices in the CIA torture black sites were exposed, that was revised, and what psychologists were able to do with and for intelligence agencies in the military was tightened up.
Which is that's a huge accolade for John Kiriakou, and that's something that is not often.
Yes.
It's something that I don't often hear, and I've spoken to John many times, and people have referenced John's work many times, but very few people put two and two together that had he not whistleblown about CIA torture.
Absolutely.
That's a humongous aspect.
John Kiriakou and Julian Assange, actually, because the group that lobbied the American Psychological Association, they used information in the Guantanamo files to help make the case that, codes of ethics and professional practice need to be revised in light of what's going on in Guantanamo and in light of what was revealed after John Kiriakou, exposed the torture program. So, our profession owes both of them a debt of gratitude, which makes me upset that more psychologists aren't speaking up for Julian Assange.
Though they may, as a result of you taking the brave stand to publicly speak in support of that.
I hope so. There's Nozomi Hayezi, there's me. I'm not aware of anybody else in the psychology.
Yet. It takes one, though. It takes one. It takes one. Others will be listening. You can be.
Yeah, because, you know, we owe both Julian Assange and John Kiriakou a debt of gratitude for helping us defend the integrity of our profession. So, you know, by revising our ethical codes and our practices. So, and this is another, I mean, I guess the way to look at these slides, it's another opportunity to do that. It's another opportunity for the psychology profession to say, well, torture was wrong and this is wrong. We, you know, we improved our ethics in light of exposés around torture, and here's another opportunity to do that again.
Well, the only other last question I have for you, I have a personal opinion from my own experience, but what would you consider would be the likely outcomes for a target of being subjected to this over an extended period?
In terms of the psychological impact?
Yeah.
Well, I guess it would depend on the targeting and, you know, the nature of it, and it sounds like there's a lot of different types of targeting. I mean, it'd be phenomenally stressful and traumatic, and you know.
For example, there's the Spy Cop scandal in the UK where activists were targeted. They were targeted online. They were also targeted in the real world, and they engaged in relationships with undercover police officers who they didn't know were undercover police officers, who only form these intimate relationships with them in order to obtain information about the other activist groups, activities, etc., etc. Some of those relationships resulted in children being born. Some of those relationships ended or were artificially ended with fake suicides or fake running off to another country, or it's really quite horrific. The nitty-gritty of this. I mean, when we see it in a slide, it's quite sterile. It's quite sterile, but the practical applications of the techniques are even more abusive than the slides themselves show.
Yeah,
because
and that's actual abuse. It's not just abuse by covert manipulation of people's beliefs. Because I guess on those slides, you know, targeting people to smear people, but then you're talking about target. That's the target of, you know, of the smear and of the destabilization, and that's actual abuse. That's sexual abuse. That's interpersonal abuse. That's really, you know, messing with somebody's life in a very predatory, very abusive way. So
in the case of the 16-year-old activist in New Zealand, they got hold of nude photographs of her and then emailed them around the police force, and like actually the informants are emailing these pictures to police officers with horrific titles, and it's just really the behavior on display is just so beyond despicable. But I feel like it's clear to me that a lot of analysis is going on the parts of the perpetrators in terms of analysing the effects of their activities, the impacts on the targets. But I don't know that there's any real psychological assessment of the targets from the impacts, you know, going the other way, looking back at the agents from the target perspective, rather than looking at the targets from the agent perspective, the intelligence agency perspective.
Yeah, which there should be. I mean, I guess it's not even sort of officially acknowledged as a sort of category of victimization and trauma, is it? Targets of intelligence operations. So it would need to be recognised first and accepted that it's something that happens, which these slides show that it is. And the IC Watch does as well. So you'd expect all the same symptoms of trauma that you would see with any kind of abuse and exploitation and traumatization. But on top of that, one of the things that's really important for people who've suffered abuse is that you can be believed and you can be validated and you can have a sense of you're not alone and people support you and they understand you and they're going to help you recover and heal. Well, if you've been traumatized and victimized by something that people don't believe is real, and that you're going to be disbelieved on top of it, and maybe even blamed and accused of, being a conspiracy theorist. That just compounds the trauma and interferes with the recovery, and exacerbates, the psychological wounds and injuries. So it's trauma upon trauma.
Unfortunately, that was exactly my experience in New Zealand when I first started to explain what was happening to me, that I was under physical surveillance and digital surveillance, that I was being targeted in these ways and probed in these ways. And the agencies, that is their number one defense, is saying, oh, they're crazy, they're making it up, blah, 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 blah. And it is something that, especially I didn't have an activist background. I didn't have an activist family. I didn't have an activist community. I didn't have any social environment that would in any way recognize what was happening to me or understand it or be able to support me or protect me through it. I was very, very susceptible to those, oh, she's just crazy, she's just making up narratives. But I'm also really lucky, though. I'm also extremely lucky. I guess one that I didn't take that on board myself. I didn't absorb those allegations or criticisms in a way that changed my own self-perception or my perception of what was happening to me. I was able to understand, I know what I'm seeing, I know what I'm going through, and those who don't, their opinions are actually less than my lived experience. But secondly, that as the years went by, more and more information came to light, which proved the veracity of my claims, even right down to the exact companies who I was telling everyone was doing it, were in fact proven to have been doing it and to have been hired to do it by various government departments. So I'm very lucky, but I know that there are a lot of targets out there that don't have that experience, that don't get vindicated, that don't have that public acceptance. I've had many apologies from people in New Zealand who've outright said to me, I thought you were just crazy too, but I know you were right. You were telling the truth. And that is a huge thing, to be able to have that validation, to have people understand that you really were telling the truth. But that is denied to so many people, and I'm really aware of that. I'm also really aware, and it's one of the things that haunts me a great deal, the outcomes for many targets are worse than just being traumatized or not being able to trust people. That some of the outcomes are suicide. Some of the outcomes are bankruptcy and total destruction of ability to produce and live and prosper on a permanent basis. Some of the outcomes are hospital institutionalization, be it in prison or a mental hospital or whatever. There really is. And in almost all these cases, there's never any justice. There's never any moment that vindicates them or validates them or frees them or restores them to their former situation. And it was really another thing that you said that resonated a lot with me is before, when you're talking about Julian and you're saying about them engineering a situation which provides cover for the abuse. When you said that, that just made me totally look at the isolation that they impose on targets a different way, because I had seen that isolation as being a method of abuse of the target, but I hadn't seen it as creating an environment which enables the abuse of the target. And that's really...
And the very sort of lack of reporting on these slides, this information does that, in that it enables that, telling people that they're crazy. Nobody acknowledges that this exists. There's a whole category of victims that aren't even recognised. So of course there's no victim support services, there's no redress, there's no validation, there's victim blaming. A lot of other areas we work so hard to work against victim blaming, that not being believed, telling people they're crazy. That used to happen to women who said they were being abused by their partners, or children who said they were being abused by caregivers. We've worked hard because we know how damaging that is, and to recognise that that's a real thing. People need to be believed, they need to be supported, they need to be validated, and there needs to be systems in place to do that. And I guess we're talking here about a category of victims which these slides, tell us exist. These slides talk about destroying people's reputations, and that can be, destroying people's lives. That's a very big deal. And then, they talk about honeypots and trapping people into, or tricking people into relationships. And these are horrendous things. So you're right, just by virtue of the fact that people don't know or understand that this happens is grieving the environment, to tolerate the abuse.
I call that the privilege of the onlooker, or the privilege of the witness, which is that they get to elect or to choose whether or not to believe something is happening. But for someone that is trapped in this situation, it's not a choice. It's not a choice. Just like a victim, a survivor of a rape does not get to choose whether or not the rape happened, but the person that they tell that the rape happened to gets to choose whether or not it happened in their perception and their belief system. Okay, let's wrap it up for tonight. I've got one more message for viewers. This has been happening for years, but it's been happening increasingly since I've started this series. Every single day, I'm getting emails from people around the world who are being targeted, and they're sharing horrific stories with me. I've had messages from people in New Zealand, in Australia, in multiple European countries, in the United States. And I am overwhelmed by the volume of them and the severity of them. And I want to just talk to you now, if you're one of these people who's been reaching out to me, and explain a few things to you. First of all, unfortunately, I don't know if I'll still have a country to live in myself in a month's time, and I'm a solo mother with 2 children. I do not have the resources or the power or the ability to reach into your countries and to help you out of your situations and to save you. And I know that there are people who are looking to me like some kind of potential savior figure or who can help them. You need to understand I couldn't help myself for many years. I may still not be able to help myself now. I have no guarantee that within a matter of months, I will even be able to keep my own family together and safe. So I want you to know that I'm not ignoring you. I do hear you. I do receive your messages, and I do care. But at this point in time, the only gift that I can give you is the information that I'm sharing in these streams, is my articles, is my tweets, is my research, and is me saying to you, I do know, and I know what's happening, and I believe you, and I really wish that I could help you. At some point, sometime in the future, if somehow everything goes my way, maybe I'll be able to build some organization or start some program or some foundation that may be of assistance. But right now, we're still in the really, really early days of this fight. I would like to say to you also that I've observed other movements of other different types of abuse victims over periods of decades. For example, what became the UK Child Sex Inquiry, the known as #CS Inquiry. For 30 years, those victims were talking about what was happening to them, and they were called crazy, and they were disbelieved, and nobody would help them. The government wouldn't help them. There was no one to protect them. Many of them committed suicide. Many of them had terrible outcomes in their lives. But after 30 years of organising and fighting, they were acknowledged. Their struggles were acknowledged. They have the official government inquiry in the UK. They have compensation and redress, and for the first time, they're beginning to achieve justice. And I'll just put the caveat in there that I know that inquiry has been incredibly problematic, and that's an understatement, as these things always are when governments finally get involved in trying to clean something up or sweep it under the rug, whichever it may be. What I'm trying to tell you is that this is going to be a really, really long fight. Likewise, the 1 versus 5i campaign and me taking on the intelligence agencies in New Zealand will be a really long fight. Kim.com's already 7 years into his process and nowhere near finished. I'm a matter of months into 1 versus 5i. So those of you, and not you targets, because I know the situations that you're in, but those of you who are watching who are not targets and who are in a position to help to support this campaign and to empower me to continue this fight, I would ask either that you go to 1versus5i.com/donate, because I have very large amounts of expenses and legal fees, expenses relating to me in exile, my legal fees around my asylum are horrific, but the legal fees that it will take to fund a serious fight against these agencies are also substantial. If you cannot donate, which many people, even if they aren't targets, in the current global economic climate, simply cannot donate, and I understand that, just simply become an ambassador for this campaign. Share the streams, share the content, share the graphics, share the short clips, go to the website, there's a whole bunch of material up there. Do what Taylor Hudak did yesterday, write #1 versus 5 on a sign and go stand outside a theatre outside the Joe Rogan Experience and let a few thousand people see it. Spread the word, build the campaign, help me to be able to help other people and to be able to set some important legal precedents, because if we can get targets winning cases against agencies, it could change things for other targets down the line. But for the many people who are DMing me and emailing me and messaging me on Discord and telling me your stories, please understand, if I don't respond to you, it doesn't mean I don't care. It just means that I'm already embroiled in the 1,000 things a day I have to deal with just to try and keep my own head above the water and my kids' head above the water and keep my campaign and everything else moving forward and all the people that I'm already working with. It hurts my heart for you to think that I don't care or that I'm just another person ignoring or abandoning you. Please understand that my service to you is this campaign, and it is my journalism, and it is my research and my fight against this. On that note, thank you so much. Thank you so much for being a part of this. Thank you, Lissa Johnson, for bringing your expertise and your experience. I deeply, deeply appreciate that we have someone of your caliber on our side. It's a really special thing. I love you all, and I will see you again next Sunday for episode 7 of Opening the Five Eyes, Exposing the Spies. Good night.
Thanks, Susie. Bye.
Hi, my name is Susie. I'm an activist and a journalist from Auckland, New Zealand. For years, I've worked on controversial issues like the corruption of our intelligence agencies. I was severely targeted as a result of my work. This led to my articles being amplified by the world's most accomplished publisher. In 2016, I made a documentary about how and why I was forced to leave my country. I have now sought refuge in Russia, and my situation has become public.
On 882 6PR, the voice of Perth.
It's 12:30 right now, and Tony with you, and I'm really happy we finally got through to Moscow to my friend over there, Susie Dawson.
You're listening to a 95BFM podcast.
Susie Dawson is a Kiwi activist and journalist who worked as a member of Occupy Auckland's media team at that time. Now, 5 years later, and following involvement in GCSB and TPPA opposition, she's seeking asylum in Russia, alleging she has been spied on, harassed and threatened by the police.
Welcome back to The Wire. Now, finally on the show today, last week it was announced that Susie Dawson will be the new leader of the Internet Party.
Welcome to the Jimmy Dore Show. We have a special guest with us. It's Susie Dawson. She's an activist, journalist, former party leader and current president of the Internet Party.
Susie Dawson, an activist and citizen journalist currently seeking asylum in Moscow. Susie has written extensively on surveillance and the deep state and claims it's not safe for her in New Zealand.
My name is Craig Tuck. I'm a lawyer from New Zealand. I act in the area of international human rights. I act for Susie Dawson, along with a group of other lawyers throughout the world who act for journalists and dissenters in high-profile cases, including the case of Julian Assange. As far back as 2012, Susie has been trying to warn New Zealanders and other citizens around the world about state targeting and surveillance of citizens and the methods being used to do it.
Surveillance in New Zealand is now so widespread, it's not an issue of police going and getting a warrant and doing an investigation and then it all coming out in court. The vast majority of the surveillance that's undertaken is never going to be aired in a courtroom. And by that I'm talking about cell phone technologies. I'm talking about lawful interception is the term that the companies that do this like to use. There is a corporation in Wellington, New Zealand called SSI Corp. And you can Google them and you can look at their website. And on their website, they're so good as to explain at length exactly what they do and how legal it is for them to do it. And essentially, they can intercept virtually any communication. If they have someone at range, they can hear your actual conversations, but also through cell phones, they can essentially turn them into microphones and hear any conversation that's had within vicinity. They can see your text messages, they can see what photos are on your phone, they can see what files are on your phone, they can read your emails, they can just intercept all kinds of information.
Any intelligence service in the world that has significant funding and a real technological research team can own that phone the minute it connects to their network. As soon as you turn it on, it can be theirs. They can turn it into a microphone, they can take pictures from it, they can take the data off of it. But it's important to understand that these things are typically done on a targeted basis.
Not only was Susie essentially blowing a whistle on state-level spying, she was naming the precise entities that years later it would be proven had in fact been doing it.
And the fact that these are private corporations that are doing it should be really concerning to us. The crowd that they outsourced it to was TCIL, which was, I believe, Thompson & Clark Investigations Limited. The state is contracting a private company to surveil you. To me, that's really immoral, absolutely immoral.
Some 6 years later, in December 2018, an official State Services Commission report confirmed that New Zealand government agencies had been employing Thompson & Clark Investigations Limited to target New Zealand citizens. This is a private company that had essentially been instructed by state agencies and departments to spy on citizens.
More than a dozen police staff are under investigation for passing sensitive information to the private investigators Thompson & Clark.
Thompson & Clark. Security firm Thompson & Clark.
Thompson & Clark.
Thompson & Clark.
So Thompson & Clark, aren't some of them old police officers?
Yes, they are.
Okay, so does that explain the relationship and the free flow of information? Doesn't it actually seem a bit crass?
Well, at the end of the day, I guess what I trust is people's intent.
The report identifies perhaps inappropriately close relationships, morning teas paid for by Thompson & Clark, invitations to go out for drinks. Were there other companies identified where you inappropriately gave them information, or just Thompson & Clark?
There are a myriad of security companies who inquire of police every day. For instance, insurance security.
But that's not my question. People listening to this will think, hey, Thompson & Clark were getting stellar, top shelf, gold star treatment from the police. Why? Do you treat other security firms the same as you were treating this one? How do you seriously think it looks to members of the public listening to this?
Thompson & Clark hasn't just been paid by the government to spy on Greenpeace and earthquake claimants in Christchurch. Tonight, Checkpoint can reveal the controversial security firm has been also monitoring the activities of another 3 activist groups in Northland, Coromandel and Wellington, and the activities of at least 1 further claimant.
Susie has been involved at the very highest levels, with people facing charges from prosecutions coming out of the Eastern District Court of Virginia in the United States. There are more prosecutions to follow of currently unnamed persons. Importantly, information will be coming out in the months to come that will provide transparency and clarity and lead to accountability. Suppression and prosecution of dissenters can't be allowed in New Zealand or elsewhere. That's why Susie's team is launching the hashtag 1versus5i campaign, and with your help can achieve some important victories for democracy and for each and every one of us.